Barbara Ehrenreich, in your 1990 collection of essays, the book was called The Worst Years of Our Lives, you write that dissent is a traditional value. First of all, where did you get that from personally, and what do you think about dissent as a traditional value?
Well, I wasn't thinking personally. I was thinking of the American Revolution, you know, where you had people like Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine and so many others who stood up against a king, you know, which was a really difficult thing to do in the 18th century when kings were still invested with a divine right. But they questioned that king, and they helped create a revolution that made this country what it is. And then if you go into the 19th century, you have the dissidents who were the abolitionists, the dissidents who were the feminists, who were the suffragists. So yeah, I'd say it's a traditional value.
Do you see yourself as part of the dissent movement of today?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Why do you like to?
No, I think I would like to see myself in that context of somebody who raises a voice when she thinks things are very wrong. I'm happy to say it's not a solitary voice. There are so many other voices, and who does not see the need to conform all the time to what we're being told to think or what our leaders might be thinking. Where
did that come from you personally? Where did you learn that?
Well, I think I have to give my parents quite a bit of credit. My father was an unusual person. I mean, he started as a copper miner, working 1 mile deep in the copper mines of Butte, Montana, and he made his way to get an education, eventually became an executive in a big company. But he always said, always ask why. Don't accept anything. Always question. And my mother, too, was a big questioner of things. She was a very liberal woman. They were sort of FDR liberals.
You talk in that 1990 book about your father watching Ronald Reagan on television while he was in the last years of his life?
He had Alzheimer's, yes. Yeah.
And what was that like what kind of reaction would he have when Ronald Reagan would come on the television?
A little bit of speech would still come back to him. I don't know if I can even say the words he used on television. But, you know, he would... No, it wasn't when he said on television. That's what it was, Connie, was that when they do tests for your cognitive ability, they ask you who's the president, and he'd say something like, Ronald Reagan, God damn it, you know. So he always got that in.
There's a quote from you in this book. You say, Ollie North was the kind of man my father had warned me about many years ago when my father was the smartest man on earth.
Oh, and he was. I mean, he told us so himself, so it had to be true. And he was very distrustful of people who sort of braid out their patriotism or were puffed up with patriotism. I mean, my father was certainly a patriotic man. He wanted to fight in World War II, but he was blind in one eye from a childhood accident, and he couldn't. But he just couldn't stand it when people sort of beat their breasts if I'm more American than you are.
Your mother went to the 1964 Democratic National Convention?
Yes, she was very proud. She was an alternate delegate from Iowa. And she got there and she joined the sit-in of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was powerfully moved by their desire for representation instead of the white Dixiecrats who represented the South in the Democratic Party then, and she joined the sit-in. I don't know how many white people did, but I was very proud of her.
You were about 23, something like that, about that time?
Something, yeah.
What was that like to have your mother at the Democratic National Convention and have her in a sit-in? How did you feel at the time, I guess is my question.
In some ways I was a little mystified, you know, that she would do that. But it was a lesson to me. You know, I myself was beginning to see, yes, there were situations when I might do something like that. But she led the way.
There, we have a picture of you when you were very, very young with your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about your grandmother.
That's my grandmother, Bernice Oxley. She was a miner's wife, as you know, I guess we're most of the women in Butte, Montana. She was a very hardworking, stoical sort of woman. When her husband died, she had a little pension, but she went to work in her 80s. She got the credentials in her 80s to become like an LPN, you know, to become a practical nurse. And she worked as a practical nurse throughout her 80s. She was amazing.
Did that have any impact on your later work in the health movement?
No. I mean, I think I was already involved in healthcare. An odd thing about that grandmother is she never complained about anything. Toward the end of her life, and she died when she was 102, she would say, well, I guess I can't complain. I always had enough to eat and a place to sleep. Well, okay.
Is that enough for you?
No, I don't think it's enough for most people. I'm just saying that's a kind of a mentality that we don't have so much anymore.
I guess I asked you because you write a lot about the overconsumption, America's overconsumption, you mentioned in some of your essays.
Oh yes, she was not part of that, no. She was very happy to have she liked to read a lot, she watched the news all the time when she was a widow, which is when I knew her best.
Now, on the other side of the family, everybody has potentially apocryphal stories in their past, but in that 1990 book, you write about your your great-grandmother and the fact that she was raised Catholic, which surprised me a little bit.
I'm not
great-grandmother.
Yeah, and her name was Mamie O'Laughlin. She was a Catholic, and when her father lay dying, so the story goes, she sent for a priest. This is in western Montana in the late 19th century, 20 miles. The priest didn't want to come. He said he sent a message back he would come for $15, which was an unthinkable sum for my great-grandmother. So that was it for her with the Catholic Church. When she lay dying, not too much longer in childbirth, a priest came unsolicited and to administer the last rites and put the cross on her chest. And the story is that she threw the cross off her chest, and that was her dying gesture, and that's why the lineage was not religious from then on in my family.
You're an atheist?
That's family values compel me to say I was an atheist because I was raised as one. But I would not soften that to say agnostic. I would say there's a lot more to know on that subject.
Okay, then you have to tell us the possibly apocryphal story of your great-grandfather being an altar boy.
Oh, do I have to tell that story?
Well, it's an interesting story to see how the religion changes throughout and what it was like for your family.
Yeah, these are also from the Catholic part of the family. Part of the family was Scottish in background. Ehrenreich, by the way, is a name I acquired in marriage. My maiden name was Alexander, which is probably Scottish and English or whatever. Part of the family was Irish and Catholic. And this story is that this great-grandfather, to get revenge on a priest who, I don't know, had crossed him in some way, peed in the holy water before Easter. Now, is this true? I don't know. But anyway, that meant he had to leave town. And hence he went west from eastern Canada, ending up in Montana, where I was born.
Where'd you go to school?
Public schools around the country. We went to 11 different public schools because we moved so often. And then I went to college, which I was thrilled to be able to do, at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and ended up going to graduate school at Rockefeller University, which is all science. Science Institute in New York City.
Why did you move around so much as a child?
Upward mobility and geographical mobility. My father, started in the mines. He got an education. We followed him from job to job.
In 1969, you had your first book published. You wrote it along with your husband, and this is it, Long March, Short Spring, The Student Uprising at Home and Abroad. What were you trying to do, and what was it like to have this first book?
Well, we were asked by Monthly Review Press if we would travel to Europe and hang out with the student movements there, and that's what we did. So we went to, I think, France, very exciting, in 1968. I mean, we got there in just after the big blow-up in May '68. Went to Italy, we went to Germany, England, and we also wrote about Columbia University in this country. So it was, I guess, my first experience ever as a reporter.
Had you been had you done your own anti-war movement type of thing for yourself as a student?
Yeah, my then husband, John Ehrenreich, and I were involved in the anti-war movement, and that's, I think, why they asked us to do this. Why they thought we could write a book, I don't know.
Why did you dedicate the book to the Vietnamese people?
Oh, because, at that time we felt bad, as did so many anti-war activists, for what was being done to their country by that war. We call it the Vietnam War. I'm sure they call it the American War or something. And we felt bad. There were 1 million deaths of Vietnamese people in that war. 55,000 American deaths. So I guess that was a gesture to say, sorry.
Did that, the anti-war movement that you were involved in, how did that impact the rest of your writing and life? Not necessarily just on war, but on other issues too.
Well, it really pried me away from my science career. I had been a pretty good student. I had bopped around from one science to another, from physics to chemistry to physics to biology. But I began to question, is this really what I want to do with my life? What impact am I really having in the world? Suppose I do something that leads to a cure for some disease, wonderful, but what kind of health system is out there to distribute that cure? So I got very concerned about health care, among other issues, and began to think, well, I want to be more directly involved in things that I think are affecting people's lives in a good way. Now, I think I also, to tell you the truth, was not really cut out for laboratory research.
Your biology was your PhD.
Yes, but I'm too impatient. I want the answer now, or in a week maybe. I want to spend weeks and weeks washing test tubes and worrying about a contamination of some sample or something. I'm sorry.
The issues that, on the health issues, came into your books in 1970. It's been over 35 years since this book was published, The American Health Empire. What were you looking for, and what did you find?
Well, this book is actually compiles a lot of people's work that we did a little group called Health Policy Advisory Center. And we did investigative work about the healthcare system nationally and in New York City, where we were based. So we were putting all that together. And we were really appalled by how poor the treatment of the poor is. And I think if we were doing it today, we'd have to say it would be a lot worse. But, that was our concern. A two-class health system at that time. And at that time was really so much better than now, because most people could afford health insurance. It was just that the health insurance available in the low-income neighborhoods meant you were really going to be like teaching a research material for some medical school.
Now, how did this come home to you in your own personal life? You were having children? Were your children?
Yes, the first pregnancy. I went to a clinic We couldn't afford private care, so I went to a New York City hospital clinic. I won't mention which one. And the care, I wouldn't say it was technically terrible, but it was remarkably sexist. I remember in my 9th month of pregnancy asking a question and perhaps using a technical word. Remember, I had a PhD in biology now. And the doctor saying, now, where did a nice little girl like you learn a word like that? And it infuriated me. And so it nudged me more into feminism, which I had never thought about. I never thought about my gender. I mean, I'd had opportunities that were beyond anything my mother could have imagined, so I didn't feel affected. So I think I like to say that in July 1970, 2 feminists were born. One was my daughter, and one was me.
We are going to have a 3-hour in-depth conversation this afternoon with Barbara Ehrenreich, who has over, 13 books? Somewhere around that order?
That's what you count.
The most popular so far has been this book, Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America, sold over 2 million copies. We'll start taking your calls in about 15 minutes, but for those of you who would like to join us via email to ask questions to Ms. Ehrenreich, you can email us at this address, which is booktv@cspan.org. Again, phone calls not for another 15 minutes, but you might want to go ahead and get your emails in booktv@cspan.org. How many years? Let's see, you were 6 years away from Nickel and Dime now? Probably. It was
Yes.
2001
Yes.
It was published.
Published in 2001.
How do you look back on it now? 2 million copies. Did you ever dream it would sell that much?
Oh, heavens no. I actually didn't want to work on this because I was involved in another book and I didn't want to interrupt the research. The other book has finally come out. It's called Dancing in the Streets. It's a very scholarly book for me with lots of research and lots of footnotes and so on. I didn't want to interrupt that, but I got myself trapped into Nickel and Dimed by a conversation with the editor of Harper's Magazine, Louis Lapham, was the editor then, and I was pitching him a completely different idea. And then I got talking about a favorite theme of mine, which was welfare reform and how were women coming off of welfare going to live on the wages available to them. Because I could just look at my local newspaper and see what those wages were. And I said, in frustration, complete frustration, I said, Louis, you should find someone to go out and do the old-fashioned kind of journalism and try living on those wages themselves. And he said, brilliant idea, Barbara, you. Well, I was a hungry freelance writer, and, here was an assignment from a magazine I wanted to do. So it was initially a magazine assignment, which I took with great trepidation. And I was thinking, all right, I do this assignment, I make a little money, I can go back to the book I'm really, really involved with.
Not so.
No, that first article was published in Harper's Magazine, it caused a lot of discussion, and so my book editor said, Barbara, go out and do some more of this and we'll have a book. I thought, well, that's easy for you to say.
Tell me what you did. I mean, what was the process? Your book.
Well, I had to. What I was trying to do was to see if I could support myself on what I could earn in entry-level jobs, and I did this in 3 different, rather arbitrarily chosen cities: Key West, because I lived near there at the time; Portland, Maine, and Minneapolis, or the Twin Cities area, I should say. So I had to find cheapest places I could to live in, and then I had to find the best paying jobs I could without using any of my credentials. Not that I think putting down on an application form is going to, that you're a political essayist is going to get you any kind of job. So, I worked as a maid with a house cleaning service, a waitress, a nursing home aide, a hotel housekeeper, and a Walmart associate.
And no one knew that you were actually doing this as research?
Oh, I was using my name. No, I wasn't undercover. I mean, I did not in application form say I was a writer, or I wouldn't have gotten hired. So there was that degree of deception, but it wasn't really undercover at all.
What did you find?
Many things. I mean, I found that it's very, very hard to live on $7 an hour, which is what I earned. Sometimes I had more than one job, which made it marginally better financially, but that's a terrible way to live. You know, when the only things you have time to do sort of are sleep and shower and eat, other than work. I also learned something very, very important and humbling, and that is that these jobs are mentally hard. Physically hard, I knew. And fortunately, I'm in really good shape. But I didn't know, here I am, PhD, lots of books published, that I would be struggling to learn every single one of my jobs.
How mentally hard? How do you mean?
All right, well, an example. You want to be a waitress today? You have to master the computer ordering system instantly. And that's not easy.
Are they all the same?
No, they're all different. You're trying to do it. You're trying to enter some little variation like wants gravy on mashed potatoes but not on meatloaf. And there's 3 waitresses behind you saying, hurry up, hurry up. You have to remember so much under great pressure. I mean, the amount of multitasking in waitressing is phenomenal. Another example of, they were all hard, but Walmart, I had to memorize, I had to be the one who picked up the clothes that were thrown on the floor or that were tried on and rejected or were, for some perverse reason, hidden in the wrong part of the store. And I had to do all that, put them all back. And the point is, I had to know the exact locations of hundreds of different items, which would then be rotated every few days for no reason I could ever figure out other than to convince me that I had Alzheimer's disease. So I was never bored. I was always struggling.
Why did you use the actual name of Walmart when you talk in your book that you didn't use the actual names of some of the other companies?
It's not consistent in the book, and my main concern was not facing a lawsuit for denigrating anybody's product. So, for example, I talk about working at a place called, I think, Jerry's, I called it. Mm-hmm. A restaurant chain, mm-hmm. And I did say things about unsanitary conditions in the kitchen. So Jerry's is not its real name. In the case of Walmart, I never said anything bad about the product. I didn't tell you about the Kathy Lee dress that was a size 7 on one side and a size 14 on the other. I'm telling you now, but they can come after me. No, it was it was kind of, a lawyer read it, we went through everything and said, I'll change this one, not that one.
And what was the reaction of Walmart? You never received anything?
No.
2 million books?
They sell them.
They sold your book in their store?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's anything much in my book that you could not know if you had read some other things or were paying attention. That it's not famous for its good treatment of its workers.
There was a quote from one of the reviews that I want to ask you about, and I can't, there it is. This is from George Leaf, who wrote a review of your book, and he said this, that Walmart's stores are bright, clean, safe places to work and seem to have no trouble attracting people who are content with the compensation, but Ehrenreich is upset that the free market transactions that she doesn't approve of occur between consenting adults.
Well, I think you should talk to the people I worked with in Walmart. There were so many things going on that I wasn't even halfway aware of. Like one of my coworkers said to me once, don't let them talk you into staying overtime because they don't pay overtime. And me, know-it-all, said, that can't be true. It's illegal. You have to pay time and a half. She said, no, they don't pay. Well, it later turns out that I didn't have that experience, that in fact, she's absolutely right. What Walmart was doing was they'd say to a person, go punch out, I've got a lot of work for you to do. In other words, your paid part of your day is over, now you're going to volunteer for a few hours. You know, people were always complaining about the wages and the health insurance, which was, you know, half of them don't bother with, mostly because they can't afford it. They can't afford their contribution. The wages, I was earning $7 an hour. That's, you know, for a lot of people working there, you can't, that's not enough to even buy Walmart clothes on. I mean, the things around us in the store were like too expensive luxury items.
As you worked for the maids and Walmart, and as the waitress, were you working with mostly minority women?
No. No, in most cases, it was white women. Not all, but, well, in Key West, it was more mixed. Our supervisors were different races. The busboys and dishwashers were Haitian and people from the Czech Republic and other places in Central Europe. But the waitresses tended to be white women. Only when I finally got a job as a housekeeper, then that's where the minorities were and the recent European immigrants were there.
Why? Did you figure out why?
Yeah, I realized that as a white woman, I was being sort of pushed toward waitressing when I'd apply at a hotel. I'd say, I'd like to be a house cleaner. I'd like to be I thought that would be a great job. I don't know. And they'd say, oh, no, you should be a waitress. And then finally when I said, I've got to have a second job here. I'm not making it on my $7 an hour in tips. Well, it's not $7 an hour as a waitress. It's $2 and change an hour plus tips. I said, I'm not making it. I want some more work. They said, okay, you can be a housekeeper too. Then, you know, that's when I was working next to an African-American woman who was training me.
2001 was was nickel and dimed, and then 2005, bait and switched. What did one lead to another?
Absolutely. I got so many letters as a result of nickel and dimed from people in that sort of situation, you know, in real life, long term, working in low-wage jobs. And I was struck at some point in around 2003 by how many of the people writing to me in that situation said they had college degrees and even master's degrees, and either had never been able to get any traction in the job market after their educations, or had once been doing well and then along came that layoff or downsizing or outsourcing, and so they had fallen right into the working poor. So I thought, oh, wait a minute, I had never thought about that. I had never thought of white-collar middle-class people as being endangered in that way. So that's why I set out to explore that world.
And what did you find?
Well, I went undercover, really undercover this time, as a white-collar job seeker with a fake resume as a PR person, and you just tried to see what it was like to try to get into a corporate job, which meant spending a lot of time with other with real unemployed people who were going to these networking events, going to these job fairs, going to these boot camps, career coaches. There's a lot of ways you can spend, or depending on your point of view, waste your time and money when you're job hunting. Was it a waste, or did it help you get a job? I don't want to give away the book, but no, it wasn't much help. So many, and it's not just me, so many people I talked to, real people with really great resumes, though mine wasn't bad, can go 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and at some point they have to give up and say, okay, I'm never going to be a marketing person again. I'm never going to be an IT person again. I have to go down to Circuit City and work for $8 an hour on the floor. That's the sad trajectory I was seeing.
Somewhere in one of your books you talk about the issue of self-respect and how that kind of glaze completely over both of those books. What happens to people who you encountered in both of those books?
Well, I don't know if people feel as much shame now over white-collar unemployment as they did in the 80s, before downsizings became so routine among white-collar as well as blue-collar workers. But, yeah, and one of the things that reinforces the sense of shame, both among chronically low-paid poor people and among people who've lost their better jobs, is that we have you get so many messages in this country that you can do anything if you just have the right attitude or if you make the right choices. Poor, what's the matter with you? You know, why didn't you go to college? Why did you have that child when you were 19 instead of 29, and so on? You know, it's all your fault ideology there. And the white-collar workers, you know, you hear this over and over when you're job hunting from the motivational gurus and in the self-help books, you know. You can have anything in the world if you just have the right attitude. So if you don't have everything in the world and you're 6 months out of a job and you've lost your insurance, you're about to lose your house, your spouse is leaving you, hey, it was all your attitude.
Are unions the answer to this? Do your books have any conclusion as to what can help both of these groups of people?
Well, unions are probably the most obvious answer for the blue-collar and pink-collar workers who are so chronically underpaid and underinsured. There is no big organizational forum for the white-collar people. So, only within the last year, I got together with some people to form one.
What is it?
It's called United Professionals. You are invited to join, Connie. Everybody is invited to join, unitedprofessionals.org. And it's not a union. It wouldn't make any sense because we're talking about people in all different occupations, really. But it's an attempt to form both a networking and advocacy group for people for whom the American dream has failed. You know, we're looking particularly, though not only, at the college-educated person who just can't get an appropriate job after college, or the person who at age 45 or 50 gets bounced out one last time, and then they're considered, quote, too old for a job. So that's what we're aimed at. We've got a big focus on universal health insurance, which would help all of us.
Goes back to your earlier books again, health insurance issue.
Can't get away from that issue.
Phone lines are open if you'd like to join us, and here's how you can do it. For Democrats, 202-737-0001. For Republicans, 202-737-0002. And for Independents, 202-628-0205. We divide those lines like that just so we can get a whole different, diverse group of people in and calling and asking questions to Barbara Ehrenreich. And again, the email address is booktv@cspan.org. Are there blue-collar jobs that are not appropriate for unions? That unions are not appropriate for, I should say.
I can't think of any. I mean, historically in our country, both, skilled craftspeople, assembly line workers, miners, lumberjacks, cab drivers. There's no kind of blue-collar person who has not, at least at some point in this country, been unionized.
Are you ever concerned that unions sometimes shoot themselves in the foot?
By how?
By how they run the union, by their regulations, by the way in which they have people join them, mandatory joining or something like that. Are unions doing the right thing in this country, I guess is my question.
Well, there are certainly some cases where one would have to be highly critical, where corruption or lack of democracy has emerged within unions. But by and large, that's not the problem. The problem is that really it's become almost impossible to organize unions. I've seen estimates between 20 and 40,000 people a year who are fired for union activity in their jobs. They're saying, they're trying to get their other workers together. Because there's no way, if you are, let me think of, in one of the kind of jobs I was in, like a Walmart employee.
Mm-hmm.
You don't like what's going on. You take the case of a woman I worked with. She fell off a ladder when she was stacking things. The boss, supervisor at that moment would not let her go to an emergency room. Couldn't take the time off, and that's typical. Then when she got back to work the next day with a little bit of a limp, the supervisor, she said, was mad at her. Now that's a bad thing. Supervisor's mad at you. He or she can alter your schedule in a way that really screws you up. So you really, you're in trouble then. Now she would have to have reinforcements to go to somebody and say, this has got to change. This won't do. That's why people come together. And when they can't do that because illegally employers are firing people for union activity, then you really have a lot of helplessness.
Did you have any reaction, what was it, 18 months ago when the Service Employees Union, headed by Andy Stern, pulled out of the AFL-CIO?
I didn't know what to think, frankly. Maybe it's all for the better, because they, sometimes it's better to have smaller, scrappier groups than for a union that thinks it's just gigantic and powerful, because they're not gigantic and powerful. They're very weak in this country. Your new book, you alluded to it, but tell us a little bit more about it. Dancing in the Streets? Mm-hmm. Oh, complete change of topic here. Now, this started a long time ago, 8-9 years ago. I spent a lot of time after my book Blood Rights, R-I-T-E-S, which is about war. I was reading a lot of anthropology, and I was struck as I read more and more by the almost universal custom of certain kind of festivities in which people feast, dance, costume, or put on face paint or masks, and, possibly drink if they have a culture that has alcohol, and, maybe do other things along with that. You can find it in just about every human culture that has ever existed. And so I started asking, why not mine? Why don't we have regular occasions where we're out in the street with, like Mardi Gras or something, mm-hmm. with masks and costumes and just having a great old time with each other? So that got me, I thought, because here's something so powerful and uplifting when you can participate in it, and yet it's been repressed. So you're talking about more than just like family reunions or things like this? Oh, no, definitely not family things. Mm-hmm. Yes, we have weddings or one occasion which people, they have costume, I guess, but, have dancing and drinking and feasting. But, no, the tradition was much more for everybody out in the streets, in the public squares. If you went to France in the 14th century, you'd find 1 out of 4 days of the year, excluding Sundays, dedicated to some kind of festivity that brought everybody together in this way. Is one of the reasons that we don't do it is because of capitalism, or the fact that people need to be at work? Yeah, the work ethic, which was really imposed on people in the 18th, 19th century, said, when you began to get the puritanical Protestants, and saying no, just supposed to work 6 days a week and spend the 7th one sitting on a hard pew listening to a long sermon. Yeah, that was part of it. But also, I think, way before that, before the rise of capitalism and industrialism, a fear that these things would get out of hand, because very often they did lead to peasant revolts, slave revolts in the Caribbean, often tied to carnival. First one, let's take an email first. This John Babick of Marysville, Ohio, asked the question, I notice that many working people where I live vote Republican straight ticket without much thought. Do you blame the Democratic Party for this, or can the people themselves be blamed for not knowing which party serves their economic interests? I wonder if he knows for sure how they vote. Certainly things have begun to change. I mean, the last November's congressional election, I think part of that changed. But Tom Frank wrote a great book on this called What's the Matter with Kansas, talking about how the right has used their so-called moral issues, which all happen to be kind of sexual morality issues, like gay marriage and abortion, to pull people away from or distract them from the issues that affect them financially.
Warwick, Rhode Island, you're first up with Barbara Ehrenreich. Hello.
Good morning. Good afternoon, excuse me. Well, I wanted to call because I remember before Nickel and Dime came out and after that time and since that time, there has been a lot of criticism directed at Ms. Ehrenreich. No, not because she wrote the book, but because of what she's advocated before and since. For example, in 2000, Ms. Ehrenreich was a very vocal advocate that the difference between Al Gore and George Bush wasn't important enough to matter. She endorsed Ralph Nader. A few moments ago, she rationalized that democracy in unions is not that significant of an issue in regards to Andy Stern separating the SEIU away from the AFL-CIO, when in fact democracy is a major issue. In fact, so many locals, some SEIU locals are separating from that because Stern has sought to corporatize the union. Now, I understand Ms. Ehrenreich grew up in a labor background and she's benefited greatly from that, but I suggest rather that she's gone into above that glass ceiling and it's perhaps become as disconnected as others have.
Rhode Island, thank you. Ms. Ehrenreich?
Oh, no, I didn't say democracy was unimportant in unions. I said, you know, it was very important and that I was very critical of unions which have been undemocratic. As for at times the Teamsters Union has been, and that's why they had a dissident, a rank-and-file organization within them. I don't see the split between Change to Win, which is one of our labor federations now, and the AFL-CIO as reflecting too much about union democracy. In fact, it may be more democratic to have the smaller units, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm not an expert on that. I'm not, I'm trying to be neutral. I guess I've been more involved with SEIU because they're more involved with organizing the poorest, low-paid workers, like janitors at the University of Miami last spring, security guards in Los Angeles now, janitors in Texas. So I guess that's a bit more involved with those things.
Ralph Nader?
Oh, Ralph Nader. I guess I'll never live that down, supporting Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader in 2000. I was very disappointed by Al Gore. He did not speak out on any of the economic issues I felt were important, from universal health insurance to, anything to do with poverty, wages, housing, nothing. So that made me very mad. Whereas Nader was saying the things I felt needed to be said on those economic issues that were central to me.
And in the aftermath? Do you wish you had done it differently?
We didn't know what George W. Bush was going to be like. I have to admit, he did not seem all that different from his father at the time. We didn't know. In 2004, I voted for Kerry. I very outspokenly did not endorse Nader then.
Dover, New Jersey.
Hi. I was wondering if maybe now, after the November election, you think there might be a truly, like a centrist consensus that says, okay, free trade makes jobs unstable, but we have to then have universal health care. Or, and by the way, I'm a Republican, but okay, union bashing is very easy in large corporations. It's very hard to form a union, but then maybe we have to have mandated 401ks or mandated wage levels or something of that nature. I just wondered if you thought there might be more of a consensus towards a genuine center.
That's an interesting point. I've always said it's impossible to have a discussion about outsourcing of, say, high-tech jobs to India, since we have no safety net here. So that when a person here loses a job in this country, they've lost everything. Unemployment insurance might as well not exist. It's so minimal. And of course, you lose your health insurance. You can maybe afford COBRA for a short time, but that's it. So we can't have a discussion about outsourcing or for, that kind of freedom of motion of capital that you're talking about when there are absolutely no safeguards for the Americans left behind. And I find it very disappointing in Tom Friedman's book, The World is Flat?
World is flat.
Flat. I said the Earth. That there's so little discussion of that. So I think maybe we could have quite a bit of agreement, or we'd have a whole different discussion if we connected those things. You're right.
Lowell in Los Angeles asks if you are still a member of the Democratic Socialists of America.
I am an honorary co-chair of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I'm trying to think who's my other honorary co-chairs. It'll come back to me in a moment, but it's an honorary position.
What does it mean to you to be a socialist?
Well, this Democratic Socialists of America grew out of Michael Harrington's organization. Michael Harrington was the author of The Other America. He was a very famous American left-winger, an advocate for the poor. And our stance, his stance, I should say, was always that we could bring democracy into the economy more. That we have a democracy which is very, very limited. When it comes to how corporations, for example, make their decisions, we've got no say. Hey, even the shareholders have no say to speak of. I mean, that's a fraud, too. So all that, you have this tiny area of democracy, and then you have this giant, I don't know, oligarchy, whatever it is, and that there should be more of a voice for ordinary people in how our economy runs too. I would add to that there are some things which I do not think belong in the market. One of them is health care. That it doesn't work out. We have a scandalous mess. Hugely expensive health care system, much more expensive than any other countries per capita, and it doesn't take care of everybody. I think there have to be limits to the free market in housing, or at least generous government subsidization. Now, there's some things I wouldn't want taken out of the free market at all, such as lipstick colors. A lot of things. I think there's more creativity and diversity with a market system.
Well, maybe you've answered this, but Robert Tate in Albuquerque says he believes that he is also a socialist, and he wants to ask you to be as specific as possible and tell us what you think a socialist America would look like.
Well, my big concern would be about a democratic America, which means and socialist, which means that I can't entirely predict because we'd have to have more and more people involved in a discussion. But I would say minimally, boards of directors of corporations or whatever other enterprises we have, public, quasi-public, private, would have to have representatives of workers and consumers on them. That would be just an absolute. There would have to be accountability. Corporations could not set up in business to do one thing and then changed into, say, financial enterprises over a few years and stop what they were doing. They're supposed to be licensed to do a particular thing, and then they should be reviewed for how well did they do that.
Back to the phones. Let's go to Gary, Indiana.
Hi. It's been fascinating to listen to. I've thought of a million other things to talk about other than my original purpose for calling. But I am union, and I'm in Gary visiting. If I was at home, I couldn't tell you what city I was in. But I will tell you that something does need to be done about the union, that they waste a lot of time protecting bad workers, and then it becomes a political thing about the elections, and it's not even about the worker anymore. I've seen my own union protect a worker that was stealing. The person got to keep their job and call him brother and all that. It's just ridiculous. Then I have another comment, is that what do you think it would take to get poor people to the polls? Not to vote for anything other than their interest. That's why politicians don't talk about these issues that concern you, because there's no penalty. It's not like they're going to pay with it with a vote. Not like your comments. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. The last one is, our electorate, the people who actually vote, is very much skewed toward the wealthy, the upper middle class, and it's tough to get ordinary people, low-paid people out to vote. One part of that is that they have a hard time believing it's going to change anything, because we haven't had politicians. I think we might this time around in '08 have ones who actually address their concerns. But another part of it I would like to point out is a practical thing. If you work 2 jobs and you're a single parent, or maybe even part of a 2-parent couple, you may not have the 25 minutes or whatever it might take to vote. It may not exist in your day. You certainly don't have the many hours it took to vote in some places in the presidential election of '04, where people waited hours and hours in line in a rain to vote. We have to have a holiday for elections. It has to be a day off for everyone.
Did you, when you worked at Walmart, when you worked at the maids and at the restaurant, did you find that the lower paid people who worked side by side with you were interested in these kinds of issues? Were they interested? Did they talk about voting? Did they ever discuss national issues that might have an impact on them?
Never came up.
Why
Never.
do you think that's true?
I just don't think it was of much interest. It didn't seem to affect our lives, or their lives, I should say. I did wonder about this, but I didn't bring it up either. I mean, actually, we would be so caught up in whatever we were doing that it was hard to say, oh, by the way, what do you think of what Gore or Bush or Kerry said about such and such? It would be completely out of left field.
What about her first question about unions who, in her opinion, go over the boundaries of supporting workers who should not be protected?
That sounds like a very particular case. I don't know that I can comment. I mean, it'd be nice to have somebody who supported you even when you were in prison. I don't know. I just don't know the story. Next
is Ellington, Connecticut. Hello.
Hello. My question for Barbara is in regard to, I was wondering if she was familiar with the Peter Principle and the fact that much of that is what we see happening today in terms of you're not getting your promotion until you perform to that level of to perform to the next level. And maybe on another note, but just the fact that my husband and I are living this outsourcing and downsizing. My husband's been outsourced twice in the last 4 years. I'm the primary breadwinner, and I will eventually be outsourced. And basically, with 25 years of corporate experience, many of the principles put forth in the book, The Peter Principle, we see how so much of that has really come around and has now become the reality of not getting the promotions, and if you're not working as hard, it's your attitude. We're experiencing this, and we just wondered if Barbara was familiar with any of that and had thought of maybe another book that discussed some of this propaganda of attitude.
Caller, can I ask you if you would tell us what industries you and your husband are in?
IT.
Both IT. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, actually, I am working on a book right now. I'm just so impressed by that insistence on attitude and how you can have anything if you have the right attitude, how you have to be upbeat, cheerful, perky at all times. So I am working on a book about that, actually. Funny you should think that. But I don't know about the Peter Principle. I never read that, but I think what may apply to you and your husband is another kind of very perverse principle that's going on, is that of people being eliminated because they're doing too well. I would never have imagined this before I went to work on Bait and Switch. But, it's a phenomenon where you get a promotion, you get a little bit more pay, and then you're a more tempting target for the cost cutters. As one friend told me, he asked for a promotion where he works, he's an IT guy, and they said, he wanted a pay raise, and they said, well, why would you want that? It would be like having a bullseye painted on your back. In other words, and I say perverse because it means often eliminating the best people because they cost a little bit more, and you want a little bit more profit in your next quarterly statement.
New York, hi.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my call. Barbara, Dr. Ehrenreich, I've been very fascinated by the two books that you previously wrote. One of them was The Bait and Switch. And as I was reading this, I was in transition when I moved to New York, and I'm thinking of involving myself with the development industry based on the struggle that takes place in the so-called third world. And I'm just curious, I wanted to request if I could do a collaborative research looking at the UN agency in the same way you dissected the American labor force and found out some of the most gruesome ill that affect the working class that sometimes make it difficult or make the American dream an illusion. And I was just wondering if you could offer an insight or techniques or ways in which I could approach that particular industry, the development industry.
Let me highlight that also with an emailer. The emailer writes, I've discussed your book. This is with Nickel and Dimed. I've discussed your book with many people, and one of the main criticisms that came up is the fact that during your investigation you insisted upon living alone in any location, whereas in many situations people, such as myself, live with a roommate in order to try to cut their living costs. Do you think that if you had done this, it would have had a significant change in the outcome of your experiment, in that you would have been able to save a small amount of money and therefore wouldn't have been perpetually playing the game of catch-up with money?
Yes, let me just say something to that caller, which is you can write to me via my website, barbaraehrenreich.com. There's a place in there somewhere to write to me. And by the way, everybody's invited to come to that website, read my blog, or it's a weekly blog, and you can contact me there. Yes, it would have made a difference to have a roommate. In fact, there were a couple of cases in Nickel and Dimed where I contemplated that. But, it's not, you know who that's hard for? Is a single mother. That's one of the things I was noticing. If you're a single mother and you don't have an extended family to fall back on, or maybe you've already been thrown out by somebody in the extended family, then you're stuck with roommates who may or may not like your children, and this may be true of relatives too. So you move in with the relatives of the roommate that you meet at work or somehow, and then she or he or they decide they don't like being wakened up by a 3-month-old or a 3-year-old in the middle of the night or something. So the single mother is in much the same situation. Roommates are not the most stable option, as I was seeing from people I worked with, too.
This emailer asks if you ever had to fall back on your own expenses that you didn't mention in the book, meaning Nickel and Dimed, or Bait and Switch.
Yeah, well, in Bait and Switch, I wasn't, trying to keep within some budget. In Nickel and Dimed, I did reveal the time I cheated. I developed a terrible rash when I was working as a maid cleaning houses, and I think it must have been from the cleaning fluids. And I thought, well, I should really go to an emergency room, because what am I going to do? I mean, I was in torment. I could not sleep. And of course, I showed up at work. I showed it to the boss, franchise owner. He said, no problem, you can work through that. So anyway, I thought I should go to an ER, and then I thought, no, I might lose my job if I take the day off. So I cheated. I have a friend who's a dermatologist. I called him up. I said, please, please send me something. Send me a prescription. And I got some kind of topical cream, and it cut the itching. So that was cheating. I later realized, though, that the average price of an emergency room visit in this country is over $1,000. So that, out of the question. You know, people think the poor can fall back on emergency rooms.
Where do
And
they
they'll
go?
collect that money, too.
Where do they go?
Huh?
Where do they go?
You know, the alternative healthcare system in this country is called Tylenol. And there's, if you are openly bleeding or something, you'll have to go to an emergency room, and they may take you within the next 12 hours or something. But there's nothing.
Columbus, Ohio, hello.
Hello. Thanks for taking my call. I just want to say that as a feminist and a woman, and I'm thinking about becoming a writer, you're quite a role model, and I believe you when you say that you're a feminist. I don't know why, because I don't know you, but of your work, I think your focus and your integrity is something to be held up. My question is, and it's hard for me to articulate, could you examine, or what do you think about the connection between the backlash on feminism in the early 90s and the 80s to the extreme poverty and the second-class citizenship of women as it relates to women that are not involved in that?
The women who are not involved in that, what do you mean?
From a class perspective.
Oh, well, I think the things went together a lot in the build-up to welfare reform. I mean, both, racism and class prejudice and a kind of misogyny, because welfare recipients were portrayed as, they were usually portrayed as women of color, very overweight, promiscuous, drug-addicted, every kind of prejudice you could apply to women, and lower class women perhaps especially, came together on that. I think a problem for feminism has always been how do we keep together the idea of all women when some women, are, very few of them are CEOs, obviously, but, when some women are very wealthy in our highly polarized society, and so many women are very, very poor. How do we keep that together? That's always been a challenge.
Besides your book, you write essays, columns. For whom right now?
I write regularly for the Progressive magazine. I write more occasionally for Time magazine, Harper's, and every week I put up something new on BarbaraEhrenreich.com.
You used to be a regular columnist for Time.
Yes.
What happened?
Then what happened? You'll have to ask them. Well, it's amazing it lasted as long as it did, but it was a lot of fun when it did.
How do you approach an essay?
I have to get really obsessed. It has to take over my life. When I'm working on something, everything else, kind of, except for family, obviously, takes second place. I will wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it. It will go. It will become pretty obsessive. I will eventually get to the point of having some sort of outline or plan of what I'm going to do. And of course, the big thing is research. And then, maybe in a day I'll tear that up and have a whole new perspective. So it's. You might say some people might say it's an ordeal, but that's how it's supposed to be.
Let me grab one. It was from May in 2004, and it was about Abu Ghraib. And you wrote on zmag.org that the photos did something to you as a feminist, that they broke your heart. And you said, what we have learned from Abu Ghraib once and for all is that a uterus is not a substitute for a conscience. What were you going through there?
I was, like so many people, profoundly shaken by the revelations in 2004 about Abu Ghraib. And the other thing, though, that I had to consider was the involvement of women. Of the, I think, 5 service people who were directly indicted, 3 were women, most notably or famously Lindy England. But it wasn't just at that level. If you went up the chain of command, I think it was Janet Karpinski.
Janice, I think.
Yeah, who, I don't know how much to blame her, but then you went up, there were, well, all the way to Condi Rice, and you could find women at various layers. So you could not say, well, those women at the bottom were just being manipulated by a sadistic male culture. You couldn't say that. You have to face the fact that our old idea, that old 1970s feminist idea, is that if you just get enough women in corporations or in the military or any kind of high position, they will change it because they are women. That there's something, any kind of moral superiority to women. So originally that was not an essay. Originally that was a graduate commencement speech at Barnard, which I was quite nervous about giving because it was a pretty harsh, not harsh, but straight from the heart, hard thing to say. But it was very, very well received by the students, I'm glad to say. So I then wrote it as a column for the LA Times.
Next is Philadelphia. Hi.
Hi. Thanks, Barbara. I love your endorsement of the In These Times webzine. And I just wanted to ask, with such bad news out of Abu Ghraib right now, I was just wondering what you think of the new card check elections that just got passed in the House of Representatives for unions.
They got passed.
The House passed it this past week.
Great. Okay, now can it get through the Senate? Yeah, I mean, this is essential. I saw this close up when the many years I was married to a union organizer. He'd get those cards signed. Overwhelmingly, the workers would want a union. And then it would go to the NLRB for the election. A year, 2 years could pass. The original workers who were pro-union could have been fired. Meanwhile, the boss would have had one-on-one meetings with every worker to tell them how bad unions were. Every form of manipulation was used. So, the card check is so important.
And this would make the card check, this would make the vote, the secret ballot vote not necessary.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
So that once somebody signed a card that that would be it.
That would be it. I mean, if the NLRB actually worked and they came in immediately after a card check and said, okay, next week we'll have the election and there can be no employer efforts at manipulation, no bringing in expensive consultants to brainwash, to try to manipulate individual employees, which they're very clever at. I mean, they'll find out, for example, your credit rating, and they'll bring you in for one-on-one and say, hey, we see, Connie, your credit rating is not so good, and we know you have a child who needs special needs, and blah, 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 blah. So
Isn't that illegal?
They'll do that.
But it's illegal.
Illegal to do that?
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not illegal. It's illegal to fire somebody. It's, but that happens all the time anyway. But
Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. Hi. Berkeley Springs. Helps if I pray. Hi. Sorry. Go ahead.
No problem. Well, thank you for having Ms. Ehrenreich on. I would agree with almost all of her policy positions, but she's a typical liberal, and being a typical liberal means she doesn't have the courage of her convictions. And by this I mean, in the summer of 2004, she wrote a column trashing Ralph Nader in the New York Times. The title of it was "It's Over, Ralph," and she endorsed Dennis Kucinich. The problem with that is obviously everybody knew Kucinich was going to be out, that he was going to raise his hand with Kerry at the Democratic Convention, and we would have no one in the general election to speak for single-payer health care, against Palestine apartheid, against the war. And the result was, because of liberals like Ms. Ehrenreich, who ran away from Nader, we didn't have a strong voice. And so I'm really sort of disgusted with the liberals because they're so stuck with the corporate Democratic Party that even this coming 2008, it's going to be Hillary or Obama or somebody who doesn't take a strong position on single payer, on Medicare for all, then we're going to be left with no one. So I think she represents the typical lily liberals who, speak the right voice but don't have the courage to stand up and take a strong stand for a strong candidate.
Barbara Ehrenreich.
Well, I guess I can't win on the Nader issue. Beaten up for supporting him in 2000, beaten up for not supporting him in 04.
Is there a candidate now for the 2008 election that you...
I don't think they're waiting to hear from me somehow. I'm...
Just for, in your own opinion.
Oh, well, I would have to say I'm less interested in Hillary Clinton, although she's a woman, because of her failure to repudiate her vote on the war. I'm most interested in John Edwards for his strong economic stance and his emphasis on poverty and universal health insurance. So I'm excited about Barack Obama. So we'll see.
Speaking of the war, you wrote this book, Blood Rights: Origins in History and the Passions of War. You mentioned it earlier. Is there, obviously this was written prior to the Iraq War, are there comparisons, or can you look at this and see the Iraq War in it?
Not really. I mean, this is quite a sweeping book that goes back even to human evolution. But one thing that I think has been very relevant is it's talking about the passions of war. In a way, war can sweep people up into a state of excitement, such as happened at the outbreak of World War I. You know, it was like a frenzy swept Europe and the United States. Like, it's how excited. We're going to go for war. We didn't know what the war was about. I mean, there was really hardly any rationale for that anybody knows of for that war. And I think that is something that can be manipulated by leaders. At the start of the outbreak of this Iraq war, it served as a distraction from the corporate scandals, which were getting closer and closer to Bush and to Cheney. Things having to do with insider trading with them, all sorts of things. I'm not saying that there was a conspiracy or anything, but it changes the subject.
Is that comparative to what the Americans felt after 9/11, or is that yet a different?
You know, since there's no link between the war with Iraq and 9/11, and it was a little bit later. I mean, the war with Afghanistan had some more link, obviously, but I think the war, for anybody who was looking at all skeptically at the rationales for the war with Iraq, had to see that there was no connection to 9/11.
Warwick, Rhode Island.
Good afternoon, Barbara. I'm so pleased to speak with you. I was first exposed to your writing as an undergraduate when I read Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, and that informed my own career choice as a nurse anesthetist. I didn't understand in Nickel and Dime the dialogue between feminism and womanliness. There was a woman who had hired your maid service to come in and clean her home, and I understood you to be angry with her because she didn't fulfill her womanly obligations to clean her own home. You cleaned your own house, why couldn't she clean her own house? And is there ever a time when we women can hire other women, or is that taking us too far into capitalism to be appropriate?
No. There's no womanly obligation to clean your own house. I think there's an obligation for everybody who lives in a house to pick up after themselves. You're leaving out the possible presence of a man, a husband, a boyfriend, whatever. You're leaving out the possible presence of children. My stance has always been, you clean up after yourself. Everybody pitches in, and for myself, I've never had people clean my house. I couldn't afford it when I could have used it when my kids were small, and now I'm single. I live in a small apartment. There's no reason I can't clean, as I always have. But no, you got me wrong on that. My big emphasis would be if you and the other people you live with are paying somebody to clean for you, pay them a decent wage, pay them benefits, and treat them with respect, so your children don't get the idea that they can be cleaned up after, that there's some kind of servant class that will always be looking after them.
You also talk when you were working for the maids that being an institutionalized or a company as opposed to an independent housekeeper, that is done on purpose so that different people go to clean the house each time and therefore there is no emotional kind of attachment? Did I read that correctly?
Well, I think just the fact that it is a company, if you use a cleaning service, you don't have a direct connection to the people who clean. Mm-hmm. You'll be talking to their franchise owner or the supervisor in an office. So, there are people who would rather have it more impersonal. There are people who would rather have it be a more personal connection. But what I was found dismaying about the house cleaning services is I think most people who use them don't ask what their actual cleaners are being paid. They know what they're paying per hour. They don't know how little of that goes to the cleaners. And I would say if you're going to use a house cleaning service, have the simple decency and curiosity to call and say, all right, I'm giving you $25 an hour. What are you giving these people who are cleaning my house?
You spend some time in the book also talking about how they work. The fact that the way that people dusted, the way that you were taught to do this, the way that you were taught to use the vacuum cleaner. Were you surprised at that?
Oh yeah, I thought house cleaning, how simple can that be? I've been doing this all my life. My mother taught me these things, but you learn to do it in sort of a factory way. You mentally divide the room into segments, and each one you go from top to bottom, left to right, moving across the room. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And partly that's just so you don't miss a place, but it becomes very, controlled. I mean, you feel like you are in a factory.
Columbus, Ohio, hi.
Hi. I'm interested and more critical of the left as well, and what I'm going to touch on is probably controversial. I'm bothered by the left abandoning the poor, abandoning bread and butter issues. And I think it's largely connected to what I call identity politics. People interested in diversity for upper middle class African Americans. Feminists interested in women's rights, but not really speaking to the working class women or the poor women. Assuming I'm right or assuming you agree, of course I'm right, do you see any signs that the left or the liberals are coming back to these bread and butter issues that are so terribly important?
Well, there's me, for example, but I don't think you are right. I just got my National Organization for Women newsletter, and very prominent in that, or maybe it was an emailing from Now, is get out there on raising the minimum wage. This is feminists understand that poverty is disproportionately a female issue, disproportionately a minority issue. We can't turn away from that. So I think you're mischaracterizing what's going on, and I think if I were you, I would check out the agenda of an organization like Now.
Lynchburg, Virginia.
Yes, good afternoon, Barbara. You said some minutes ago that you were profoundly shaken by the events of Abu Ghraib. And, when we look at your books, and you can see that it seems that everyone who has power over someone else treats them with total contempt. So why should you be shocked of what happened at Abu Ghraib?
Well, I guess I'm naive, but not everybody who has power over somebody else treats them with contempt. I mean, one relationship of power that is quite different is the relationship of a parent to a child, or of a teacher to a student. I mean, we have many such relationships where power is involved, and either love or respect, too. I think I had not only greater confidence in women not to behave like that, but a sense that my country would never disgrace itself as it has in recent years. It disgraced itself not only in Abu Ghraib, but in Guantanamo, in the secret prisons, wherever they are in Europe. This is deeply, personally shameful to me as an American.
Riverside, California. Hi, Riverside. Let me push the button.
Hello, Barbara.
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I've read your books, Bait and Switch and Nickel and Dimed, and my predicament is I'm divorced at the age of 40, and I have a 4-year degree and had to raise a son, but I'm older now, but it's been a number of years, and in between I've had to be content and could only obtain low-wage jobs. Do you have any suggestions for me to get a higher-paying job with my commensurate with my degree, or any organizations that I can contact?
Yeah, this is such a common problem. One thing I want you to know, you're not alone, whether you were 40 or 24. This is, many people find that college degree was just a very expensive lottery ticket, really. It's no guarantee. I would ask you to visit us at unitedprofessionals.org. At least we're discussing the problem, undertaking advocacy around it. We're building up to offering more services to our members, too.
Lewiston, Maine.
Hello?
You're on the air. Go ahead.
Hello. I was just calling because I'm from Maine, where we used to have a lot of factories, a lot of shoe factories. And I was just interested in, how, like, they don't make shoes in this country anymore. I think there used to be a lot more jobs, like it used to be, like in the 50s and 60s, it used to be a lot easier for people to just go get a job in a factory. And these were often jobs anybody could do because, like I've tried waitressing, I've done different jobs, and some of the so-called easy jobs nowadays, they're not easy. Even working in fast food, you got the cash register with the computer that you hit the right buttons and all that.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is you're touching on a very profound problem here. Is that 30, 20, even 20 years ago, we were much more of an industrial nation. We did make shoes. We made garments. We made, cars, and to a greater extent, and we deindustrialized. Those jobs, manufacturing jobs, went overseas. Leaving what's behind is relatively low-paid, so far largely ununionized service jobs. That's why the working poor, the old jobs that you could support a family on with a high school degree, are gone.
Burlington, Vermont.
Yes, I'm wondering why. Because I'm supposed to ask a question, not just express myself. But I am poor in the standards, although they say, let the poor say they are rich. But I often wish that I could speak to, or that the people working, quote, for poverty, which is where I used to be when I was in high school, living in a sort of middle class, but I'm not anymore, and I don't want what they are trying to give us, basically. And I wonder,
can you explain that a little bit more? You don't want what who's trying to give you?
Talk to the poor. You talk about the poor and try to give to the poor, but you don't talk to the poor or listen.
Ms. Ehrenreich.
Very good point. I mean, how often are people in poverty invited into policy discussions? I've been around poverty experts who talk about the poor like, there's some anthropologically distinct group. And so you're absolutely right. The real movement for change will come when people at the grassroots get together to find their own issues and how they're going to go about it, create their own policies, and that's what I mean when I talk about real democracy.
I'm going to ask you about a column that you wrote for Harper's Magazine in 2001 called Welcome to Cancerland. Why did you write it, and what's it about?
In late 2000, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and which is bad enough. I had surgery, went into chemotherapy. So I reached out in every way I could for support, other women. That's my feminist tendency. But what I kept finding in the books and the websites was something that really repulsed me, which was this business about being positive, being upbeat. Think of breast cancer as the best thing that ever happened to you, that you're going to come out a deeper, more interesting person, along with buy yourself a pink breast cancer teddy bear. I think that's what really put me over the edge, the idea of a breast cancer teddy bear.
Why?
Why? I'm a grown-up. Connie, here I am in the most serious disease, huge crisis of my life, and somebody wants me to buy a teddy bear? That's infantilizing. I was disgusted. So I wrote an essay while I was undergoing treatment, which might have affected, I was angry, about this pink ribbon culture that we have surrounded this disease in. Yes, it's fine for people to raise money for breast cancer research. I hardly approve of that. But I don't think we should think of breast cancer as something soft and cuddly and pink and cute. It is an ugly disease. The treatments, insofar as they are treatments, are disfiguring and debilitating. I think we have to face some really hard issues and not treat women who have it as if, well, they're 5-year-olds.
You call them a cult.
The cult. The pink ribbon cult, yeah.
Who does that include?
Well, it's some of the leading breast cancer organizations. I fortunately can't think of the name.
The Komen?
The Komen
You mentioned
Foundation,
that.
yeah. And
do you include the American Cancer Society in that?
Yeah. There's
Why?
a whole cancer establishment. And so it was like taking on apple pie and motherhood when I wrote this essay. But I was angry.
And you also are very critical of some of the companies that have supported the pink ribbon movement.
Well, I was just pointing out it's one of the easiest, cheapest ways for a company to signal that it cares about women of a certain age, anyway, is by saying, oh, look, we get a little pink ribbon on our products. We give 0.0001% of our profits to breast cancer research or foundations or something. It's very fashionable. I wasn't, criticizing them, but for that. But, it's become an industry. You want good public relations with women? Get this pink ribbon out there somewhere.
Feel the same thing about Lance Armstrong and the bands?
No, that it never had struck me as involving the same loss of dignity or sort of prettifying an ugly condition.
You tell the story of the day that the nurse called you and told you that your test results look good at the end of your cancer treatment.
Right. Yeah, what happened? She called
Well,
me
I get you talk a little bit about how she told you you should be proud, I think.
Oh, I should be proud of being a survivor. And I thought, I didn't do anything except I went through this treatment. I was strong enough to get through the treatment, but I don't like to use the word survivor because I think it puts down those who do not survive. Is somebody who died of the disease, and I had a friend who died just 3-4 years ago of it, is she any less heroic? Did she battle it, as we say, any less strongly than I did? I can't say that. I don't. I would honor the dead more by not, saying, "Hey, I'm a survivor."
The essay is also very critical of what you call the lack of research into the causes of cancer.
That's right. I would support something called Breast Cancer Action, BCA, which is a feminist group that supports research into the causes and is also quite critical of treatments. So if you want an unbiased, woman-centered point of view, you can go to bca.org.
And what would make them critical of a treatment? What would it be about the treatment?
Well, the treatments are changing all the time. 5-6 years ago when I was treated, they were using chemotherapy much, I think, more than they are using it now. I wish at the time they had been more, more. You see, breast cancer isn't one disease, it's many diseases. They have no way of personalizing your treatment. So you may be getting a treatment for another person's breast cancer because they weren't, trying to distinguish at all. That's one problem. Chemotherapy is no joke. I mean, it does severely weaken you and set you up for later problems of some kinds. So that was one thing to be critical of. Is that why this one-size-fits-all treatment?
Next call is from Ukiah, California.
Right on, Barbara. I am enjoying you immensely. Older than you, have been through many of the same things you have, except I didn't become an activist until I was 50 and gave up adulthood and started doing all sorts of interesting things with my life. One of the things, by the way, on the pink teddy bear, thank you for speaking out. It's a great fundraiser. All those little pink things and red things have turned into wonderful fundraisers, but they don't do much for the patient. I worked in medicine and related businesses for about 20 years with seriously ill people, and they don't want to be mollycoddled and babied, and they have a right to grieve for losing what they've lost. Many times their vision or limbs. Look at our soldiers today. I don't think anybody would give them a camo teddy bear.
Good point.
Not to be too cynical. However, one of the things that I ran into, I became ill with one of these wonderful musculoskeletal conditions in my 40s. It was virtually unknown. No treatment, no cure, no known source. But still about the same thing, although there's been some improvement. I kept working for 13 years, but it was very difficult. One of the things that a lot of us faced, all of the applications ask you if you have, health conditions. Nobody knows what the law is on it. I have called all over the place. They haven't hired you. They haven't even shown an interest in you. What business is my health care to them at that point? And now, with them being able to access most of the health records of people, real damage can be done by a doctor's thoughts on what you might have. So that would be something I'd really love to see someone look into seriously, because you're terribly vulnerable. If you tell the truth, you probably won't get hired if you're over 40, especially because, after all, you'll cost more. And if you lie, then you're lying on your application, and it's grounds for firing if you do get the job.
Yeah, that's a rough one. I think the laws have to be checked state by state. In many places, employers ask those questions when it's not legal to. And one of the other troubles is if you say, I'm not going to answer those questions because I don't think they're appropriate, is that could mean you don't get the job. So I think we need some concerted action on this practice. It is not their business if you've had cancer or a neuroskeletal condition or whatever.
But who's going to do that action? I mean, you have two people in a room. One's interviewing the other. One person, the interviewee, is the interviewee going to go out and try to organize this? The interviewer obviously is not going to.
Well, I mean, by concerted action, would have to come from legislation which is actually enforced, that say you cannot ask that question.
And there are some questions you can't ask.
And you're not supposed to ask about a person's marital status. Right. And yet that has been used against women.
Or age, I think.
Well, age, yes. And also, having children has been used against women. It's not supposed to be part of the job.
Laguna Vista, Texas.
Yes, Barbara, I'm proud to be a part of the human race with you.
Oh, thank you.
One thing that I would like to go back to is that the people that you worked with at Walmart and the different places in that level, they didn't know what was going on because they weren't watching the news. They didn't take the newspaper. They couldn't afford a newspaper. And they didn't have the time to watch the news on television. And therefore, they were not up on the politics of our country, which is a sad thing. But that's just a fact of life. They were trying to get through life in the best way that they could, and why listen to the news and keep yourself upset about something you felt you couldn't do anything about?
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, television watching is a luxury for a lot of people.
Barbara Ehrenreich is going to be with us for another 90 minutes or so. We're going to take a short break, then more calls and emails from you.
In the coming months on In Depth, on April 1st, journalist Alexander Coburn, author of the book End Times, The Death of the Fourth Estate. In May, professor of journalism at the University of Texas and author Marvin Olasky. And Lewis Lapham, author of the book Pretensions to Empire, on June 3rd. For a complete listing of programs and times, go to booktv.org.
We're in New Rochelle, New York with writer Barbara Ehrenreich. When you're working on a book, what is a typical day like for you?
No, I don't know if there are typical days. It might start with research. You know, most of writing is research for me. Actual writing is a small part of it. So I might be reading books and making notes in them. I might be searching for things on the internet. But then as you get closer to writing, there is this, for me, the biggest issue is making an outline, deciding what the flow is going to be of the thoughts, what the order of things is going to be. And I might do that for days, ripping them up, doing new ones. So that when I sit down to write, you know, I know where I'm going. Not that that can't change when you're writing, too. I never was one of those people who could sit down at a typewriter or a computer and just let it flow out. I have to have thought a lot of things out in advance. Then putting sentences together is the least of it, really. Maybe it goes back to the science education. The first things I wrote for publication were scientific papers. And those are organized very precisely. You know, what you want, introduction, materials, methods, results, conclusions, etc. So, you know, that kind of logical approach to things may come from the science education.
What about in the course of the day? When do you start? How long do you work? Let's separate research from the writing.
No, I could be writing and then suddenly say, oh, I'm stuck, and realize the reason I'm stuck is there's something I don't know. And everything has to stop right then for more research. You know, a lot of times when people are having trouble writing, it's because there's something they haven't found out yet that's blocking them. But there's no, in terms of, do I start at 6 a.m.? No, there's no pattern. I might start anywhere from, you know, 7 in the morning till 10. It depends what's going on in the rest of my life, and I usually come back to it late in the day to think, you know, reflect on what I've been doing and where I'm going, so that first thing in the morning, you know, I might have some new ideas.
And then you have some books here in your office. Are these books related to your latest book? Is that the way you do it? You sort of keep books around that you need to refer to, or how do you go? Where do you go for your research?
Well, most of the books that are sitting behind me, except for some by myself, are from the last book I wrote, so they really don't deserve to be in the study anymore. They're related to the book Dancing in the Streets. Then there's another, say, a little clump there of books that are sort of self-help books related to business, which I've been reading, not for self-help purposes, but because I'm going to be writing, I have been writing about that a lot. So actually, I need a librarian to come here and redo this. This is not a good system.
Just in general, how many books do you keep in your apartment, and how important are they to you?
I try to keep the number of ambient books down to a minimum, because I don't think books are a decoration. I don't think they should be just sitting around. I think they should be moving out to other people who can use them. So I might, at various times I've packed up boxes and taken them to a community college or some other place that can use them. I'm always looking to get rid of them or asking people to come in to see if there's anything they want.
Do you use the library?
Yeah, there's a library right across the street here, a public library. I use that. I have at various times finagled access to a university library. Very essential for the more historical books I do. But if you're not part of a university, as I'm not, I'm a completely independent, you have to work on that access.
The physical way that you organize your outline and your research, do you keep computer files? Do you keep paper files? How do you do that?
Both. I mean, I always start the process longhand on paper. Scrap paper, recycled from manuscripts and drafts I've done. Then I might get to the point where I'm ready to type up a very detailed outline. Now this is for a book, mind you, not a blog, where this process is obviously much quicker. And that's a big turning point in working on a book, is when I can type up a chapter outline and be putting in facts, statistics, quotes that I'm going to actually use in the actual writing. And that'll take days, if not possibly weeks.
If you've worked 4 or 5 hours and it's getting tedious, what do you do to decompress or relax?
What do I do? That's easy. I can go to the gym, which is excellent for clearing my mind. I mean, I guess I use it for psychological purposes as well as anything, because it's physical. There's no way I can continue to consciously concentrate on my work. And the other thing I do is go hang out with my little granddaughters, who are 5 and 2. And they are in their own little wacko world of fantasy and things that are important to them. And I have to put aside whatever I'm thinking about. And that's really good. Sometimes when you're working, you've got to put all aside. So it's just kind of mulching there in your subconscious mind. And a lot goes on there, too. But those are 2 ways of having a radical break.
February 22nd, the New York Times reported on the trend among presidential candidates to write books. Here are the works of 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans currently seeking the White House. Joseph Biden's autobiography, A Better Place, will be published later this year. Hillary Rodham Clinton's It Takes a Village has been re-released in a 10th anniversary edition. Written while she was First Lady, the book addresses child advocacy issues. Chris Dodd's Letters from Nuremberg is slated to be published in September. It's an account of the Nuremberg trials based on the letters of Thomas Dodd, the Connecticut senator's father. Dennis Kucinich details the start of his political career as the youngest ever mayor of Cleveland in A Prayer for America. Barack Obama's The Audacity of Hope has been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for the last 11 weeks. New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson chronicles his life as a Hispanic American in Between Worlds, A Spanish translation titled Entre Mundos is also available. Sam Brownback's From Power to Purpose is scheduled to hit bookstores in July. Rudy Giuliani's New York Times bestseller Leadership describes his management of New York during and after the 9/11 attacks. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee considers the major problems in American government in From Hope to Higher Ground. John McCain's latest is due out in August, Hard Call, Great Decisions and the Extraordinary People Who Made Them. Former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney writes about his leadership of the 2002 Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City in his book, Turnaround. Finally, In Mortal Danger, Colorado's 6th District Representative Tom Tancredo on border security and immigration. For reporter Julie Bosman's article on these and other candidate books, visit the New York Times website at nytimes.com.
We talked to a lot of writers in this series over the past, I think, almost 6 years now for In Depth, and most of them are very meticulous about their writing. When they get up, what time they write, what time they break. And it was interesting that we find out from you that you don't have that kind of habit.
Uh-oh.
And yet you're a successful writer. So, I mean, is that more about you, or is that, do you think writers have over-organized, or?
Well, most of my life as a writer is not writing. Most of it is research or reading or calling people or something like that. I mean, how would I have something to write unless I did that?
When you're doing that research, do you make a point to read opinions that are opposite of yours, or as we've always talked about, you know, anybody can look at the same statistic and see two different things, so that do you read what you don't agree with?
Well, yeah, sometimes that's what gets me going, you know, inspires me, or maybe makes me see it in a different way.
I want to show our viewers 1995, Barbara Ehrenreich essays, The Snarling Citizen. So this, you have two collections of essays over the years. What was this one? Did it have a theme?
No, there's no theme. We're just, my pub editor and I were just taking columns and essays from the last couple of years and throwing them together.
You dedicate this to my Aunt Jean, the funniest woman on earth.
Oh, she was, yes. I miss her terribly. She was a nurse by education. She was a homemaker most of her life, but she was hilarious. I mean, just witty and fast-talking, extremely smart.
I ask you about that because you use a lot of humor, not necessarily one-liners, but a lot of humor throughout your very serious writing on very serious subjects. How did you come about that, and do you find it difficult or easy?
Well, first, I don't use humor. I simply report the absurdities as I see them. You know, it's there in the world. But that habit of seeing the absurdity in the world, well, I guess some of that came from my father.
Why is that?
And from Aunt Jean, yes.
How did that play itself out?
Well, he was a very ironic, sarcastic guy, and that seems to run in the family. My brother, sister, nephew. Is it genetic? Who knows?
You know, throughout your books, you write in a variety of ways about alcohol in your family, specifically your father, but I think you mentioned it with your mother also.
Yes, they both ended up as alcoholics.
And did you know that at a young age?
Oh, I wouldn't have known the word. And always, you know, meals were served. We, you know, there was that sort of thing went on, but it took a long time into my teen years to realize there's something wrong here. But at that time, there was certainly no way for me to conceive of how they might get help, and neither of them did.
Neither did.
No.
Has that had any manifestations for you, either personally or how you write or what you write today?
Not that I know of. I think it would take a psychoanalyst to get at that. I'm just not sure. And they were also, you know, fine people and inspiring people in many ways. But, you know, they had come through a hard path. They had started quite poor and come really into what was finally sort of the upper end of the middle class, or the lower upper end or something. And it was more, I think it just was more than they could handle in many ways. They couldn't process it all.
We haven't talked about your own children. You have?
Oh.
How many?
I have 2, but they're perfect, so I didn't need any more.
And who are they? What are their names?
Ben Ehrenreich is my son. He's actually the younger one, and he is a freelance writer in Los Angeles, based in Los Angeles. And there he is on the screen, doing a very bad thing, that is hanging out with a grizzly bear.
He seems to be very happy in that picture.
That is a very bad boy. Anyway, he was on assignment there. My daughter is Rosa Brooks, who is, you see her there with my 2 radiant, sprite-like granddaughters. Rosa is also a writer. She's a columnist for the LA Times, though she lives in the New York area, and she is a human rights lawyer, very active in human rights issues.
So your son had a new book out just last year?
His first novel was published last May. It is called The Suitors. It is amazing. Oh, you have a
No, I don't have a copy of it. I was pulling your novel.
My novel doesn't. It doesn't even shouldn't be mentioned in the same breath with my son's really amazing, brilliant novel, which I found profoundly moving. I didn't even know what it was going to be about. You know, was it going to be like Mommy Dearest? Who knew? But it was a novel I truly love.
So having 2 children who are both writers, did you talk about writing as they were growing up, or was this just a fluke?
No, they saw me, you know, they saw how I lived.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as my son has said in interviews, you know, he got the idea that you could have a very happy life without going to work. You know, that here was this crazy mom who was just down in the basement, that's where my desk was for years, and doing pretty much what she wanted to do. Well, you know, I had to make money. I never, and this may sound very strange as a parent, but I did not encourage them to have jobs. I did not encourage that. I said, do what you love to do. You know, and figure out how to make money. My daughter's more practical. She has a day job.
We showed our viewers the video of your writing area and in your apartment now. How long have you lived there, and you know, where is home now, I guess is my question.
Home is in the New Rochelle, in New Rochelle, New York, so I can be close to my granddaughters, who I spend a lot of time with them, and which is probably the, you know, happiest time next to having some breakthrough in my work that I have. And if they move, I'll follow them again. I'm a stalking type grandma.
Are you single now?
Yes, I am single now.
1993 was your novel. You wrote a sci-fi novel. The only novel? Where did that come from?
Well, my life as a scientist, my other life, when I did get that PhD in science, I remain a science fan, that into the sense I, you know, read Scientific American, Discover, keep up with things in that kind of layperson way. And so that, you know, I keep coming back to it. And so this sci-fi novel was an attempt at that.
There's something we didn't talk about when you're in your Cancerland essay. I don't think I had ever read anybody who asked to see their own results of their cancer tests, to actually see the science of it.
See the cells.
You asked
I
to
wanted
see
to see
yourself?
the cancer cells.
What did you do?
Well, my friend, the dermatologist, set it up so I could, with the pathologist, so that I can come to the lab and look through the microscope and see my own tissue slices and see the bad cells.
Why did you need to do that?
Well, because I was a cell biologist. I've looked at lots of cells under the microscope, and I don't know why I had to do it. I had to, And it was nothing to do with I have to visualize them because I can destroy them with my brain. Mind, I didn't think that. I just, I don't know. It was sort of an assertion of dignity. Let me look. Let me see for myself.
Back to the phones. Muncie, Indiana. Hello.
Hi. I have a few comments and a couple of questions, and then I'll hang up and let your guest answer them. On the subject of outsourcing jobs, this began with Ronald Reagan to deregulate everything, which is essentially just getting rid of laws. We have laws because we needed laws. That's why they were put in place. And it took tariffs off all the factories, all our factory jobs. And she can explain that. But essentially, it enabled all these industries to move abroad and get absolutely free labor. I mean, when you pay somebody 17 cents an hour to make tractors in Bangladesh, that's free labor. And on the subject of why they're doing this, I would like to say that there must be some reasons why all this has been done since Reagan. Because this just didn't happen all of a sudden over a few years' time and say, well, guess what, things have changed, and we can't do this anymore, and we're going to work at Kmart from now on. You know, outsourcing jobs not only provided free labor, but I'm sure the Republicans got a lot of money out of this.
Well, yeah, I think you're right about President Reagan being a turning point. I think what I think of associate with his time in office that was so bad for labor was his busting the air traffic controllers union, PATCO, and that really was a major turning point in union power in this country. I hadn't thought of him so much in terms of outsourcing, but you're raising, I think, a really interesting point.
Schaumburg, Illinois. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hi, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
I am calling from the Republican line, and I just want to make two comments and one quick question. Number one, even the previous caller, the world is a changing place. Number two, I'm hearing the liberal doom and gloom. And being that you are a researcher of seeing people in tough spots, and I've been involved with people that are having hard times, why don't you start writing books like What Color's Your Parachute? Like, okay, you're in this situation. How about the positives? There's got to be positives in everything that you've been out there. So I'll let you answer. Thank you.
Well, the big reason for that, and I think it's a fair question, is that I am emphasizing the positive. When I say we can do something, but my emphasis is on the we. We can change things if we come together and work for change. That's why I invite people to come to unitedprofessionals.org, for example, to work on change for things affecting the middle class today. I'm not saying nothing can be done. I'm saying we can, if we have that can-do spirit. Just don't think you can do it all by yourself.
Vancouver, Washington.
Hello, Barbara.
Hi.
I've got in front of me your article from the February Harper's called Pathologies of Hope, and I'm so pleased to hear that you're writing a book on the whole self-help industry. It's kind of funny, that you're going to, the way self-help affects business literature, but it has kind of tragic results when it gets involved with, like, therapy and mental health professionals. I was in a group once, and I had someone reference Nathaniel Branden to me, and he was that teenage lover of Ayn Rand. But anyway, Barbara, in one of your earlier books about why men fear commitment, I thought you did a great job describing how a white man like Hugh Hefner really symbolized the post-World War II generation of white men who essentially betrayed their working-class proletarian backgrounds and began to aspire and even to self-identify as members of the bourgeoisie. As a white man myself, born in 1971, I feel that my generation and all that follow are continuing to pay for what really amounts to a white male sellout of the working class from about 1945 to 1980, especially in the South. That being said, I have to say I agree with that previous caller who was attacking identity politics. Ralph Nader refuses to talk about things like gay rights, abortion, and affirmative action. And I really admire you for sticking to the bread and butter economic issues like replacing capitalism with socialism. And I think on A&E, Bill Curtis did probably one of the best television treatments of your book, Nickel and Dimed. And I hoped you could go into the point you made that these people living in these McMansions in this luxurious lifestyle are essentially being subsidized by the working poor. And, you know, it's often said that the rich pay all the taxes. Well, there's a reason for that. They're reaping all the profits.
Vancouver, we're going to let it go at that. A lot on the plate. First of all, I just want to show our viewers the book he was talking about. It's from 20 years ago, The Hearts of Men.
I think it's still in print. I'm not sure.
America's Dreams and the Flight of Commitment.
Flight from Commitment,
Flight,
yeah.
Excuse me, Flight from Commitment.
Yeah.
And what the basis for this book was what?
Well, I was responding to what you heard so often in the 70s and still hear sometimes today, that the women's movement was undermining the family, that women's liberation was anti-family and making women want to leave their husbands and so on. And what I wrote about was, you know, really the male revolt against the family, showing that it went back earlier than Betty Friedan and feminism, was this idea of coming from men, Hugh Hefner among them, but many others, saying, why should we support women? Why should we be breadwinners? You know, keep your money for yourself and have a good time, guys. So that's what inspired me, and I talked about that male revolt and how it left many women in the lurch. You know, women who had decided to be homemakers and then found they could not support themselves and their children when that man took off or whatever.
The callers alluding to your plan to write about self-help. What made you move into that direction, and what can we expect?
It's not self-help itself. I mean, I'm interested in this entire kind of ethos that you should be cheerful, perky, and upbeat at all times. I think so many of us encounter that at work, or we encounter it from career coaches or motivational speakers or the self-help literature. And one of the effects of it is that it denies the fact that some people are in pain, that you can't grieve, that you can't be sick, and it shows a greater intolerance towards other people's suffering.
Next call is from Mableton, Georgia.
Very interesting program here today. I'd like to, first of all, say that I have a great deal in common with Miss Aaron. I am around the same age. At the age of 16, 17, I was a liberal, and I was down at the, actually in 1968, they had the Republican convention in Miami. That was when Nixon was running. Jane Fonda was there. I was there. I was one of the first subscribers to Ms. Magazine. However, I have gone a different way in my late 30s. Anyway, I have two things I'm concerned about. One, first of all, the Abu Ghraib situation that you spoke about. I don't find it surprising that women were involved. Women are human beings. I also don't see the big flap about it. I mean, if you've watched television, you see that colleges, when they do hazings on the college campuses, they do worse things to those men than were done to those prisoners in Abu Ghraib. My second point is, I hear a lot about, from the, let's say, the Liberal Party, about the separation of church and state. Are you aware that right now, as you and I are speaking, there is a political rally going on inside a black church in Selma, Alabama? Why is it that the white churches who try to support or lay out the positions of the different candidates and say, here's their positions, you vote for who you feel, you know, is most in line with your conscience, they are investigated and hounded and harassed by the 301c, where they get free, what is
501c. Thanks, caller.
Yes, I think, I mean, I'm not sure about this, but I think there's one difference between, there's a big difference between using a church as a venue, as a setting for a rally or a get-together or something, and having certain kinds of directives, political views, coming officially from the church, like here is how a Bible-believing Christian will vote. That, I think that's the kind of thing that gets the attention of the law as far as church-state separation goes. As for the mistreatments of people in Abu Ghraib and other settings like Guantanamo being equivalent to fraternity hazings, I have to say I find that comparison distasteful, and that it trivializes the issue of torture. I think torture, of all the bad things that have happened in the past 6 years, that weighs most heavily on me. It makes me embarrassed to go out into other countries as a citizen with that as part of our reputation now.
San Diego, hello.
Hello, hi. My name is Rick, and I'm a disabled veteran. And I did serve. I got out recently, but my issues that I see is with the feminism. And I'm not saying that it's bad or anything. I appreciate your book, Barbara, that you wrote, Nickel and Dimed. That was a good book. But the issues that I see is with the family court system. I did have a family, and now I was made a non-custodial father. But I look at the inequalities in the system of how the system that's today it's set up for exploitation of the family and ultimate destruction of the family. And the question I have is what's is this something that's an awareness with the feminist, or is this something that what's going on to be resolved on this? Because we have with children, the basic thing is children are growing up, and this is a repeat pattern. So what is your comment on it?
I don't really know what the issue is that you're confronting, but I as a general principle, the children's needs have to come first, should come first. We are coming out, there's still a big bias often in courts toward custody to the better paid parent, the wealthier parent, which is, by the law, statistically going to be the man. And that may not be best emotionally for the children. These are really heart-wrenching decisions in every case, but I think we're coming out of a lot of bias against the mother.
You think there's bias against the mother? This gentleman
in
said he
that
thought
sense that the children were supposed to go to the more affluent parent.
And this gentleman was giving the impression that he had lost his family in the court process.
Yeah, I don't know the circumstances though, and he may well have a case.
An earlier caller brought up the program that was done by Bill Curtis on Nickel and Dimed, right? This was, or a piece he did.
Yeah, I think it was called Wage Slaves. I think it was called that. Yeah.
And I bring that up because there have been stories that there's a play out of some of your books.
Those are true stories. There is a play called Nickel and Dimed. I didn't write it. It was written by a real playwright named Joan Holden. It has been performed in many commercial theaters around the country. Not Broadway, but certainly big performances in Seattle, L.A., Chicago, Minneapolis. I've been to some of those performances, and it's now being put on often at colleges and even high schools.
In terms of colleges, are your books used as college textbooks?
Nickel and Dimed is assigned in I think it's over 600 colleges.
Oh, did that help the 2 million number?
I guess.
So a lot of college students are reading this as part of a course.
Yes.
Next is Manchester, Connecticut. Hello. Let me punch the button. Hi.
I'd like to thank you for your research. Most people of your educational achievements wouldn't have bothered to go out into the trenches again, and I thank you for that. But I worked 20 years in sole proprietorships and franchises and walked out as poor as the day I walked in until I got a job in a privately held, non-listed company. And my question was, have you noticed in your research a relationship between the treatment of workers and the structure of companies?
Structure in what way, caller?
Partnerships, franchises, those types of arrangements.
Okay.
Is there a relationship?
I have to answer that. I really don't. It's a good
What do
question.
you see, caller? Do you see some?
Experience to see that being listed on a stock exchange really damages workers. That's my opinion, but I don't have the large amounts of data to really say that it's true everywhere.
And what gives you that impression?
That I spent 20 years in the sole proprietorships and franchises and got nowhere, and only when I went to a non-listed company that was relatively large did they offer things like health care or tuition reimbursement.
Okay.
And I see that trend going back in that direction with the privatizing going on now, and I think maybe I was wondering if that's a good thing.
Thanks. Any thoughts?
No, it'd be worth finding out.
I want to go back to an issue that you talk about a lot, or not a lot, but in Nickel and Dimed, and that was as you were preparing to work for Walmart. And you talked about having to take a drug test. Why are drug tests not a good idea for large employers?
Well, I don't think they find out anything useful. A study by the ACLU, or actually the ACLU put together all the academic studies on drug testing, and they've found it.
Having a coughing fit, aren't you? I'll tell you what, we're going to let you have your coughing fit, take another call, and we'll come back with both of those. Go ahead, caller. Your next call is Del Mar, California. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm sorry she has a cough. My name is Bonnie Russell, and I operate USAJudges.com specifically because the media, the male-dominated media, is perhaps a reflection of our society and ignores the one court most often used by the public for the longest period of time. And I'm wondering, why does the media do this when 80% of the women killed in California are killed by their, quote, intimate partners? And the nonprofits have all but taken over family court. On the side, I run FamilyLawCourts.com, and the emails I receive about this mess, the family court has become a police state. And you have anger management classes that don't work, and it's just abysmal.
Any thoughts on that?
I'm going to let that be an answer to the earlier question.
Okay, we can take that. Dayton, is it Dayton, Nevada? Dayton, Nevada, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for taking my call. I just had a quick comment and a question. I'm sure Ms. Ehrenreich has noticed the kind of really poor financial performance of some of the largest union employers in the U.S., like Ford, GM, and like the various airlines that have needed bailed out of bankruptcy. So I was wondering if she could talk a little bit about the really horrible competitive disadvantages that unions put businesses in.
And what are, in your opinion, are those disadvantages?
Well, those disadvantages, there's a global economy, and Toyota's doing really well in like the auto industry, and they obviously come from countries that don't have such a union presence. And I was just wondering if she could just talk maybe specifically about that auto industry example.
Okay, thanks.
Well, for years, the auto companies did very well while paying good wages and offering good benefits. So, it doesn't automatically cripple. I mean, you didn't see the auto industry just go right downhill after the 1930s when the unions came in. Also, Toyota is coming from a country that treats its own workers pretty well, that has in some ways a higher standard of living than the United States. But ultimately, is that a fair trade-off to say, well, either we have strong companies with high profits and poverty, can we do that? Why can't we have a vibrant economy that also treats people well? I think it's possible. Look at the fact that 29 states have raised their minimum wages in the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, 5, 6 years. And those states are doing well. They haven't collapsed. That you can actually do better if the average worker is paid enough so that they're able to spend on their basic needs and has good health care and so on.
This emailer, Jackie Brown, asked, I wonder if you might consider investigating the plight of the older worker faced with younger bosses. I'm a near 50-year-old experienced legal secretary and find that many of the younger attorneys, particularly the women for whom I work, treat me as little more than another piece of office equipment. Most recently, I was reported to management for the irony of talking back and then not talking to the offended lawyer. The humiliation of it all. I've been professional as long as most of them have been alive.
Well,
did any of that come out in Bait and Switch?
Well, what came out in Bait and Switch, or began to discern, was a huge prejudice against hiring people over a certain age. And they will say things, like, well, you're going to have younger bosses. Can you live with that? So, I mean, that's something that people do have to get used to, but I think it's just hard to even get a job if you're over 40 or certainly over 50 these days. But I would invite this caller to write to UnitedProfessionals.org about her experience. We'd like to hear it.
And United Professionals, again, is what?
This is an organization that I and some other people started. We just launched, actually, last September. It is for, all kinds of workers, but middle-class workers who find themselves unemployed, underemployed, that is, working in jobs that are not what they were, kind of thing that they were educated for, or anxiously employed.
Anxiously employed. What is anxiously employed?
That probably includes you, too, in the media economy. That's a lot of us.
The media. You talk about the media in your books. Has the media been a helper to the worker or a hindrance?
Well, I think all too often the media have ignored or do tend to ignore people who are sub-upper middle class. I mean, if you look at the sitcoms, and I have to admit I don't often, the Friends variety, for example, are all about these amazingly affluent people. I would say there are definitely exceptions now, but you don't often see, say, a blue-collar person, whether that's a nurse's aide or a forklift operator, on TV news being asked something, speaking. They're just what we're hearing from most of the time when we're hearing people opine or explain things, it's white guys in suits and ties.
Byron, Michigan.
Mute, Jack. Good afternoon, Barbara. I have two kind of comments I would like to make. I've enjoyed your work very much and have been doing that type of research, although I have all the reverse credentials, no degree, no prominent family, no, etc. But I am just working away at how we can have better change toward a better direction. I would like to hear your comments on the idea that there's a principle we're missing in our idea of competition in the business world. We can compare it to sports. The losing team still gets paid really well. And in business, it seems that there's this everybody can be a winner idea that you're talking about with your self-help, whereas the very concept of win contains the concept of lose. And the losers have to also be able to live a decent life. That's one comment. The other one, I do intend to email into your Barbara Ehrenreich website, but I'd like to give you a heads up about it. My name is Arlita, and I have a tactical mechanism idea for leapfrogging over the entrenched power of the two-party system. I need that idea to get plugged in to the level where it can get juice, which I can't do from my kitchen table out here in the middle of Michigan. And I hope that you will receive that email and possibly be interested in helping it get to be a conduit to help it get to the level like Lewis Lapham or Robert Shearer and those people that might be able to do implementation. It's got nothing to do with gain for me. It's all about just implementing.
Thanks.
Well, I certainly agree with the caller. you know, we need to, you know, it's been said often enough, we need to look more at win-win situations. Maybe we need to re-examine our whole idea of what is a winner, what is a loser. Why do we, you know, why do you even have those terms? I've just been watching the movie Little Miss Sunshine, and I think that it's interesting because it sort of goes after that dichotomy in our thinking that you're a winner or a loser. What's the game? You know, what's the prize?
Now I want to go back to the drug testing issue, which we've interrupted from
right.
earlier.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. No,
drag a cough drop myself. This is what you get from hanging out with a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old too much.
Makes sense.
But it doesn't. Drug testing, pre-employment drug testing, doesn't accomplish anything. According to that ACLU study, doesn't reduce absenteeism, doesn't reduce accidents, doesn't increase productivity. In fact, the only thing that they're likely to detect is marijuana. And that reason being that heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines are water soluble and go through the body very quickly. So you're not going to find, you know, if the person had those 2 days ago or something, they're going to be completely gone. But I think more importantly, it doesn't have that much to do with how you have the job. Do the job. Test people, like if it's important, like an airplane pilot. I actually don't care what they ingested last week. I want to know that they are completely sober and clear-headed when they come to work that day to fly the plane. That's called performance-oriented testing. That's what we should be doing. The rest of it, what you do in your spare time, what you put in your body, I don't think is your employer's business.
A question about what you reveal in your books, personally, because in terms of the drug testing, you went on to talk about the fact that you weren't sure that you could pass the drug testing when you were...
Yeah, you see, I didn't do these jobs back to back. I had long periods in between when I was doing other things. And so I was from one of those periods. I thought I might be in trouble. So I went through what many people go through, the huge amount of water, taking the various products, just to be absolutely sure whether it was necessary or not.
Now, but you revealed that in the book. And then, and I also saw an article that you read, it was a guest column for the New York Times last year on the issue of abortion, where you, at the end, revealed that you've had 2 abortions. Why, not everybody that writes like this is so self-revelatory. Why do you decide to be?
I'm not ashamed. I don't see anything shameful about that. And if we keep, you know, especially on the issue of abortion, if those who've had abortions remain shameful and silent about it, that, you know, just means that we're going to lose the option of choice. So I have to say, yes, I had abortions. I had them for this reason, because I already had children. I could not afford any more children. And I'm not ashamed of it, and I've never felt any guilt or suffering from that, you know, from that decision.
Do you think that if more women were self-revelatory in that way, that it would help out the movement?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, Ms. Magazine recently published a huge long list of women who said, yes, I've had an abortion. That same tactic has been used in France, too. Names.
Go ahead. Gainesville, Florida, go ahead.
Hi, Barbara. I just had a question concerning, you know, maybe a historian. I'm sure you've heard of Howard Zinn. If you've read any of his stuff, and if you know, just like care to comment on what Howard has written about, and I'm sure it sounds like it very much pertains to some of the, you know, research and some of the works that you've done. Thank you.
Oh yes, I think Howard Zinn is a great man. I think his People's History of America is a classic, and so yes, I'm a fan.
This emailer, Randy Richardson from Dallas, asked the question, do you find it contradictory that you criticize consumption but then want poor people to make more money so that they can consume more? Isn't there a sort of implied envy in that argument?
Well, I think when you're looking at poverty, you're talking about not being able to consume some very basic things, such as possibly enough heating fuel in the winter. such as possibly a warm winter jacket for the 7-year-old who's grown out of the old one. I think that the stereotype that we're just talking about a $100 pair of sneakers is wrong. There is such a thing as basic needs. Now, admittedly, that's tricky, but I think as somebody who at this point in her life has enough, in the way of clothing and food and shelter, that it would be, immoral for me to sit here and say, well, if you've got to make do with that jacket you wore last year, or no, that you're not going to have enough heat at night, so you're all have to go to sleep in one big bed.
Lauderdale by the Sea, Florida. Hello.
Hi. I have been listening for over an hour, and I'm very interested in what Barbara has to say. But it seems to me that she's concentrating on all the problems, and there are obviously problems, but through my career, I have observed wealthy people, middle-class people, and poor people. And one of the major differences I've noticed is that rich people are always working. They never seem to take some time off. If they're not working at their job, they're working around their property or working to build their investments. And I think that the advice of, looking to the government, to me, that's a short-term stopgap. But what we really need to do is find out what the problems are, why people are in poverty or in need. Things like, are they getting married too young? Or are they not getting married? Or are they getting pregnant too early? Are they staying in school long enough? I don't hear those things emphasized enough. I think if people concentrate on those issues, you would eliminate 90% of poverty and 90% of these problems.
Well, you're echoing, a very long-standing conservative view, which is that poverty is really a result of personal shortcomings, bad choices, personal character failings or something. Bad choices like failing to go to college, or like having children when you're too young or something like that, rather than looking at anything systematic that might cause poverty, such as the fact that college is too expensive, probably for the majority of people now in this country. So I think if there's a left-right difference, it is that I would say I have to look at the systematic things that are holding people down. And as far as the work ethic goes and how hard people work, I think you should have spent some time with families where the grown-ups have to work 2 jobs each to keep things going. You want to see hard work. Look, there's no time for puttering around in the backyard with that kind of regimen. And sadly, not enough time to spend with children either.
Did you find women in the jobs that she worked on for nickel and dimed who were happy in their situation? I mean, happy in terms of what they did, maybe not happy with what they made, but had no illusions of really, or even interest in wanting to climb any corporate ladder?
Well, there was this one woman who told me she was a waitress, that she had once been offered a promotion to manager, and she said she turned it down. She said she wanted to be, and I forget her words, but they were sort of so old-fashioned. It was something like, I want to be an ordinary worker. And, there are people, I think she took a lot of satisfaction from her job. People do take satisfaction from jobs like waitressing. I did, in a way, because you're giving people food. What could be nicer? I took satisfaction from the job in a nursing home, because if you can bring a smile to somebody's face, that makes your day. So it's not that the jobs are always intrinsically awful. In fact, there's a lot of reasons to find satisfaction in these jobs. They're just not rewarded with enough to live on.
Next is Evansville, Illinois. Hi, Evansville.
Hi. I'd like Barbara Ehrenreich to address a trend that I imagine she deplores. But since she's emphasizing that things can be made to change, I'm wondering what her position, her suggestions, and United Professional suggestions is toward the trend in the university sector to resist hiring full-time permanent employees and hiring instead adjuncts who get about one-fifth the salary or pay. For example, the average salary for a course is about $2,500. So even if you're teaching almost full-time, that is, let's say, 7/8 time, you make about $16,000 for what other people on the faculty are making 60 for. Now this is, as I understand, I believe I read this in the Chronicle of Higher Education once, that 40% of the liberal arts faculty is now adjunct, which also means they don't qualify for medical insurance or group plan medical insurance.
This is a big scandal that the caller is talking about. The fact that we're depending for our higher education is dependent so much now on totally, grossly underpaid part-time faculty. They may work full-time, but they might have to patch that together by going to 4 different campuses in one day. No benefits. I've met adjunct professors who moonlighted as cleaning ladies because they love teaching. They're just not getting paid. So this is definitely something United Professionals wants to address, and I urge you to join.
This emailer asked the question, you mentioned that because you weren't in a university and you had to work around where you could do your research, do you think that there is a shift in this country to restrict the access of information to only those who get into the prestigious institutions? In other words, is information and knowledge only really easily accessible by the upper class? And how does this affect the blue-collar workers' desire to educate themselves?
It is tough, and I think that the thing that most concerns me is the underfunding of public libraries. I have always depended on public libraries, and I could do quite scholarly research from them through interlibrary loans. This is been so important to me, and we see them cutting back their hours, not having enough money for new acquisitions. This is scary, because that was a historical equalizer that you could go to a public library, because you're sure as hell not going to get into the Yale University Library. A state university library you can get into and use, so you can't check books out.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, you have to
be private universities.
You have to have private, you have to have sharp elbows to get into some of those.
This emailer asks a personal question. How does a freelance writer handle health costs in this U.S. corporate? Can you share with us your health
It's
insurance?
been very difficult. I used to get my health insurance through the National Writers Union. Then we were bumped by the company that was carrying us. They just got rid of the whole union. We went to another company. The same thing happened. I have been paying a very large sum to keep an individual, keep some individual health insurance. Having had breast cancer, there's just no way I can, make that smaller.
This emailer asks, would you be in favor of eliminating the minimum wage and instead instituting national minimum health care coverage?
Why? Why do I have to make that choice? Why not both?
New York, go ahead.
Hey, hello?
You're on the air. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask Barbara, have you considered doing research or writing a book on the lack of availability for health care for a large proportion of Americans, like yourself?
I think that is been done, and I have heard that Michael Moore is now working on a film on this, and I know another documentary producer who is doing. I think there's no shortage of people working on bringing that to attention.
This emailer says, I wonder what you think as a writer about the current and future state of book publishing and the dissemination. My question is, what is the purchasing audience that you're thinking of when you publish a new book? Whom do you want to reach, and where are they likely to buy books? And two, where do you think serious readers and book buyers will be found in the next few years?
Oh, those are a lot of hard questions. I think my editor at Metropolitan Books would like to know the answers,
well,
too.
She's referring back to Fear of Falling, and she talks about the fact that she said she wishes it were still in print.
Oh, I didn't know it's not in print.
Well, I don't know.
Oh, that's a blow. it's very hard. Newspapers are seeing a shrinking readership. Serious books are seeing a shrinking readership. Books are overpriced. I think that hardcover books are priced out of the reach of most people. So it's a problem. Now, when I sit down to write a book, I can't be thinking of all those issues, though. I have to just think of what do I want to say, how can I say it most clearly, and hope that there will be people out there who are interested enough to buy it.
Lindale, Texas. Good afternoon, Lindale.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question, or a question about having the stock market on our economy, and that would rely on them. Right now, we're having trouble even supplying our military over in Iraq because they don't have enough money to really make the products to get these make them where they're safe. That's one thing. Another thing is that in NAFTA down here, they moved our automobile plants down to Mexico. They did not upgrade these people's wages. They did not lower the price of the automobiles. They strictly went into profits, and so therefore NAFTA has strictly failed in that regard. Another thing is same way with our health care. As long as we're having people that is just raking off profits off of the medicine and then off the stock market, the price of health care is going to remain high, and unless they take on that situation, they're not going to solve the problem.
Welfare, did you say?
Healthcare.
Healthcare, yeah. I think I agree with you on all those things. One other thing you might have mentioned about NAFTA is not only the loss of U.S. jobs, but what it did to agriculture in Mexico, removing millions of agricultural jobs, and the result of that is, desperate people coming from rural areas of Mexico trying to get into this country to make some kind of a living. And that's not discussed enough when we hear about illegal immigration, is that NAFTA really destroyed the livelihoods of so many millions of Mexicans.
You mentioned to us, and it was on the list of people who have influenced you, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more specifically, who is Dave Dellinger and how did he influence you?
It's kind of arbitrary to think of who influenced me, but Dave Dellinger was an anti-war activist. He was a pacifist, somebody who believed in no kind of violence ever in the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. And then I actually worked with him at a magazine project in the mid-1980s, and I was very impressed by his egolessness, his absolute commitment to nonviolence in every way. I'm not that. I'm not a pacifist. But I admired him for his complete consistency.
How about Arundhati Roy?
Arundhati, I think it's
Arundhati?
Yeah. Sorry. She's a wonderful writer, an Indian woman, and she's also an activist. And that's what impresses me. She could spend all her time writing her beautiful novels, but instead she's involved in very grassroots struggles involving the poor in India.
And one more, Frances Fox Piven.
Frances is a close friend. She's somebody who helped steer me toward more of a consideration of women's economic issues, the issues of very poor women.
Moab, it's Utah. Moab, Utah, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to thank the author. She inspired me to have the courage to let go of needing to make money and to follow what I felt I wanted to do with my life, which was to work on environmental issues that nobody really wants to pay for. And through doing that, I have unleashed my own creativity and interacted with my own local environment, and actually I'm learning a lot about self-reliance. So I wanted to thank her for having the courage to do all those low-wage jobs, and also I think I was able to see how little one really needs in order to have a very healthy, happy lifestyle.
Well, that's the follow-up question, caller. How did you make a living doing that? How do you make ends meet?
I do different jobs, contract cleaning, and I do recycling pickups, but just enough so I can pay my rent and my utilities. And all the rest of the work I do has to do with cleaning up recycling and trash. There's thousands of pounds of it littered all over our country, our world, in the streams. And I work with local government, and I work with the BLM and different groups, but everything I do falls in this black hole of nobody really wants to pay for it. So I go out, and I'm out in nature cleaning up, and it's just beautiful, and I could never be happy in a Walmart behind a register, or I'd much rather just barely be making it, and I have so much more, I think, than a lot of people, and I'm inspired partly by her work, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm inspired by you. That's amazing. Thank you.
How much reaction like that or contradictory to your beliefs came out of Nickel and Dimed? I mean, what was the influx of reaction from readers?
Mostly, overwhelmingly positive.
Did you get a lot of stories?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I mean, I get responses from quite affluent people saying, oh, my God, you opened my eyes. I never even noticed all these people around me who were serving me, cleaning up after me, whatever. The other response was from people in these situations themselves saying, yeah, let me tell you my story.
San Francisco, hi.
Hi. I have a question. With the infrastructure being important to our country, in particular, United States, right? Well, that's what we're talking about. What do you foresee with the lack of infrastructure over the last, 6-7 years, and the basically the tax ripoff that's been going on in our country? Do you see a breaking point in the future, or do you see an overall change of consciousness where we're going to turn into a positive, more democratic country?
Well, I agree with you. Something has to be done about it. I'm amazed that so many highways and roads in metropolitan areas in this country, seem like third world situations where you can fall into a pothole and have trouble getting out. So yes, this would be a huge priority if I were president.
Whittier, California.
Hi. I'm calling because I haven't seen one book or anything on the American people, what we have gone through to bring up our kids in this country, that we've done it all alone, without fathers, without going on welfare, working little odd and jobs here and there. And you know what? And we've made it. I've made it, thank you God, without a credit card. Never had a credit card in my life. And I give the thanks to my parents that brought us up that way. And they told us if you don't have the cash, you don't buy it. And my kids now, they have kids. And I'm seeing people from other countries come here. And they get welfare, they get Medi-Cal, they get everything. And meanwhile, the American kids can't go to school unless they pay or get any kind of benefits. So I would like to know, why is it that we leave other people from other countries come here if we can't afford to pay all Americans their schooling, their Medi-Cal, and stuff like that? And then I'm on Social Security right now, and I can't get food stamps. They said no food stamps, but then they give it to the illegals, and how could that be?
Well, sadly, from my point of view, immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants or illegal, as you said, can't get any welfare. I don't know if they can get Medi-Cal anymore at all either in the state of California. And the only kinds of recent immigrants who get brief, temporary help that's of any note are refugees from war zones, which would include some Somalians, some people from former Yugoslavia. But I think otherwise you're repeating a kind of a myth that immigrants can come over here and get all these benefits that the rest of us don't have. The rest of us don't have these benefits because they're not there.
And so do we allow, but I think her question was also whether we allow these people to come into the United States when we don't have those benefits.
I think, first of all, we need to have those benefits for ourselves. I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's a shame if she's struggling and Social Security is not enough to live on and can't get food stamps. I find something wrong with that. But I would not blame a recent immigrant from Mexico before I looked at my state legislators or, you know, the government. I'd look at the powerful, not at the poorest and the most powerless.
Back to a writing question. Someone in one of your reviews says that the power of your writing comes when you write first person, like in Nickel and Dimed and Bait and Switch, and that your writing, when some of the other books that we have looked at, is not as compelling. Do you ever think about that as you're looking forward to it, or do you enjoy writing first person more?
Sometimes it's not appropriate. Sometimes it's not about me. Sometimes I'm not an actor in it and barely a point of view. So it just depends on what there is to say.
Do you feel that your writing on other issues is as strong as your writing in first person?
I like to think so, but you see the difference is Nickel and Dimed and Bait and Switch are first person reporting. Present tense, you are in the moment there with me. That's not all I want to write. I want to write history, like Dancing in the Streets, my most recent book, and then there's no way that can be in the first person.
Rochester, New York, hello. Go ahead, Rochester.
Barbara, with her science background, with regard to the new vaccine that's being mandated, considering mandated in all the states for young girls, and she has the 2 young granddaughters, I think this is a great concern right now that we could be mandated. I live in Rochester, New York, and we also have the University of Rochester, which made the vaccine. However, they made it for the Merrick Company, which is giving them a percentage of the profits of the sale of the drug. And that distresses me terribly. Maybe it was rushed to market or whatever. And I just wondered what her views would be.
This is for uterine cancer.
Yeah, no,
right?
I've actually thought about that in connection to my granddaughters, and thought, well, first I would want to know everything possible about safety of the vaccine. And if it does, you know, meet my standards and the research I can do, I would definitely want them to have it.
Have you written about it, or are you thinking about writing
No, I
about
don't. I don't know enough about it.
Next is Fort Lauderdale. Hi.
Yes, hello. My name is Nicole, and I'm calling because first I read Barbara's book several months ago, Nickel and Dimed, and I really, really loved it, and I can identify it with it. I work as a waitress, and I earn about $350 per week. Yet 20 years ago, when I was 18 years old, I earned about $300 per week as a telephone operator. Clearly, the cost of living has increased since then, yet my wages have stayed almost the same. And it seems to me that employers are not sharing as much of the profits as they used to with the workers. The only reasons I get by is that I have no debt, no children, and I save as much of my earnings as possible. I'd like to know what Barbara thinks about this.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the ways we could see that is that wages went up somewhat in the boom years of the late 90s and 2000. But, you know, maybe from $5-something an hour to near to $6 an hour. Wages did not come up to any kind of living wage, even at a time of great prosperity. And yes, we also know from studies that the largest proportion of effort of, you know, despite productivity gains, the largest proportion is going to profits than at any other time in history, the larger proportion of corporate earnings. So, yeah, the workers are getting less.
This emailer is talking, I think, about the issues of from Bait and Switch. He says, I'm an accountant currently looking for work, and I'm appalled by the number of placement services out there. At least 1/3 of the job listings in CareerBuilder.com for the greater Nashville area are controlled by a company called Robert Half, and another 30% are from the other placement services. These organizations combine the worst aspect of a used car lot and a modern-day slave auction, he goes on.
I would invite this writer to write something for us at unitedprofessionals.org. We'd like to know more.
What was your experience when you went out to try to get ready for a professional job that you talk about in Bait and Switch?
I had career coaches. I paid them. I even had an image makeover to become more corporate. I'm afraid it didn't take too well, but I did have it. And I thought a lot of this was really hokey. I thought a lot of it was also really exploitative of the job seeker.
But do you think it works?
No.
Do people get jobs
I mean, I had
from
one
this?
career coach who gave me a personality test and then told me I should avoid all jobs involving writing. I mean, he didn't know I was a writer, but, you know, if that was my personality test is crazy. You know, so it's a lot of manipulation. It's a waste of time, I would say.
You also wrote about how people should dress. The image coach was talking to you about how you should dress.
I know I'm not right today. But
no, but the question being, what does that mean when someone makes the decision to dress in the way that the company asks you to?
Well, I just think it's really absurd when you think about it, that companies are going to make judgments about you and the quality of work you can do from the color of your scarf, or whether you have a lapel pin on or something. I'm sorry, what that's about is demanding conformity at a level that's not their business, and that people put up with it. Well, it just shows how weak we are relative to the corporations when it comes to jobs.
What about the employer who says, well, you represent the company when you're out there, and therefore you have to look a certain way?
Then issue uniforms, all right? Don't put the cost on the worker. Just say, here's your uniform, you wear that when you go out.
La Jolla, California, you're next. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Barbara. My name is Joan Christensen. I have a question relative to reverse outsourcing, particularly of engineers and doctors. Rural doctors today are comprised of about 25% from foreign countries. Also, as far as educating engineers in America, we are number 27 in the world, which is really pitiful. There are certain groups like Achievement Rewards for College Scientists, a nonprofit volunteer organization that does support college-level engineers and scientists. I'm just thinking that perhaps here in America we've really dropped the ball in terms of encouraging young people to go into the sciences. Now, you having been a scientist and apparently are not in that field any longer, I just wanted your take on this. Are we missing the boat in terms
Oh, yes. And I don't know, where the problem is, whether it's that people don't anticipate they'll be paid well as a scientist or engineer, or whether it's just not being taught well, though there may be some of that. But it breaks my heart when I travel from campus to campus and find so few students that I'm likely to meet who are majoring in the basic sciences. So many who are majoring in finance or marketing, and so few in physics and chemistry.
We had not talked, I don't think, about this book yet. Just to mention it, Global Women, 2002. So this came between Nickel and Dimed and Bait and Switch. Is that correct?
Yes, and it actually was written between the two, or put together. It's an anthology. I didn't.
And what is you talk about the migration?
Yes, this is a book co-edited by sociologist Arlie Hochschild and me, and it's we put together articles about especially nannies and maids, women who are migrating from poor countries to wealthier countries to raise other people's children, clean their houses, and what struck us is that they are often leaving their own children behind. That was sort of the thing that just got us going at the beginning. How all this caring of children gravitates to the wealthy countries, leaving children in the Philippines or in Sri Lanka or wherever who may not see their mother for years and years.
Has the path of migration changed over the years?
Well, there are many different paths. People go from the Philippines to Hong Kong. They go from Mexico to the Caribbean to the United States, Northern Africa to Europe, and so on.
Crown Point, Indiana.
Yes, my name is Maria. This is the first time I've ever done this, so I'm a little nervous. But I'm so you have awakened me in a strange way. I worked for, I don't know if I could name the company or not here. I'm not sure if that's okay or not to do. But I guess I will. I'm not, they booted me out anyway. I worked for the IHOP here, and I was in management. And I felt that all the men that I was working for, I felt like I was that sister washing all the clothes, but they were the ones dressed up pretty and nice. I pressed the clothes, washed the clothes, but they were the ones that were getting the okay to pat the back. Boy, you look really good, But I felt as if that's what I was doing. I was doing a lot of work in the business. I was learning, though. I thought it was an education at the same time. But because I challenged one of the managers, I was booted out.
I don't think a lot of companies are looking for independent thinkers or anybody who's going to challenge people, and that's a shame. I mean, that's very worrisome from a business point of view if you don't have critical thinking and creativity going on.
Camden, Maine.
Hello. I want to thank you for your books addressing social injustice. I've really appreciated them over the years, but I wanted to talk to you about your ideas about cancer. I had a cancer episode several years ago, and I was really taken aback at the time and began thinking about this whole notion of someone who has cancer all of a sudden, it seems, is supposed to adopt an identity of a cancer survivor and then begins to focus the rest of their life on thinking about their cancer, being a cancer survivor, and overcoming it. Rather than on wellness and on getting on with their life, that some people don't survive, as you said, and then this idea that people are waging a valiant battle with cancer, which I often read in the obituaries. And I personally have felt that what that does is it takes away living one's life when one isn't affected by it, and furthermore, it co-opts the energy of people to address the real causes of cancer, which have to do with toxins in the environment and the food chain, and instead raising money to fight cancer once people get it.
Right. I agree with you, and I think one of the things that people with any disease most resent is people just identifying them with that disease and sort of losing their own identity. You are still you when you have cancer or, whatever the ailment is. And yes, we have to find out what the causes are of so much cancer, and I would say things like autism, big mystery, whether that's in the food or in the environment or whatever. That should be a #1 priority.
If you are interested in reading Barbara Ehrenreich's column that she wrote, or rather her piece that she wrote for Harper's about cancer, you can go to her website. They have put that on the website so that you can read it, and that website is
BarbaraEhrenreich.com.
And these are the two books that people talked about and that you did the personal research for, Nickel and Dimed and Bait and Switch. And Barbara Ehrenreich's new book is Dancing in the Streets, A History of Collective Joy. Thank you so much for spending this 3 hours with us. Appreciate it. And thanks to our viewers. Have a good day. Barbara Ehrenreich, in your 1990 collection of essays, the book was called The Worst Years of Our Lives. You write that dissent is a traditional value. First of all, where did you get that from personally, and what do you think about dissent as a traditional value?
Well, I wasn't thinking personally. I was thinking of the American Revolution, where you had people like Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine and so many others who stood up against a king, which was a really difficult thing to do in the 18th century, when kings were still invested with a divine right. But they questioned that king, and they helped create a revolution that made this country what it is. And then if you go into the 19th century, you have the dissidents who were the abolitionists, the dissidents who were the feminists, who were the suffragists. So yeah, I'd say it's a traditional value.
Do you see yourself as part of the dissent movement of today?
Yeah, I'd like to.
Why do you like to?
No, I think I would like to see myself in that context of somebody who raises a voice when she thinks things are very wrong. I'm happy to say it's not a solitary voice. There are so many other voices. And who does not see the need to conform all the time to what we're being told to think or what our leaders might be thinking.
Where did that come from you personally? Where did you learn that?
Well, I think I have to give my parents quite a bit of credit. My father was an unusual person. I mean, he started as a copper miner, working 1 mile deep in the copper mines of Butte, Montana, and he made his way to get an education, eventually became an executive in a big company. But he always said, always ask why. Don't accept anything. Always question. And my mother, too, was a big questioner of things. She was a very liberal woman. They were sort of FDR liberals.
You talk in that 1990 book about your father watching Ronald Reagan on television while he was in the last years of his life?
He had Alzheimer's, yes. Yeah.
And what was that like what kind of reaction would he have when Ronald Reagan would come on the television?
A little bit of speech would still come back to him. I don't know if I can even say the words he used on television. But, you know, he would... No, it wasn't when he said on television. That's what it was, Connie, was that when they do tests for your cognitive ability, they ask you who's the president, and he'd say something like, Ronald Reagan, God damn it, you know. So he always got that in.
There's a quote from you in this book. You say, Ollie North was the kind of man my father had warned me about many years ago when my father was the smartest man on earth.
Oh, and he was. I mean, he told us so himself, so it had to be true. And he was very distrustful of people who sort of braid out their patriotism or were puffed up with patriotism. Her father lay dying, so the story goes. She sent for a priest. This is in western Montana in the late 19th century, 20 miles. The priest didn't want to come. He said he sent a message back he would come for $15, which was an unthinkable sum for my great-grandmother. So that was it for her with the Catholic Church. When she lay dying, not too much longer in childbirth, a priest came unsolicited and to give her, administer the last rites and put the cross on her chest. And the story is that she threw the cross off her chest, and that was her dying gesture, and that's why the lineage was not religious from then on in my family.
You're an atheist?
That's family values compel me to say I was an atheist because I was raised as one. But I would not soften that to say agnostic. I would say there's a lot more to know on that subject.
Okay, then you have to tell us the possibly apocryphal story of your great-grandfather being an altar boy.
Oh, do I have to tell that story?
Well, it's an interesting story to see how the religion changes throughout and what it was like for your family.
Yeah, these are also from the Catholic part of the family. Part of the family was Scottish in background. Ehrenreich, by the way, is a name I acquired in marriage. My maiden name was Alexander, which is probably Scottish and English or whatever. Part of the family was Irish and Catholic. And this story is that this great-grandfather, to get revenge on a priest who, I don't know, had crossed him in some way, peed in the holy water before Easter. Now, is this true? I don't know. But anyway, that meant he had to leave town. And hence he went west from eastern Canada, ending up in Montana, where I was born.
Where'd you go to school?
Public schools around the country. We went to 11 different public schools because we moved so often. And then I went to college, which I was thrilled to be able to do, at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, and ended up going to graduate school at Rockefeller University, which is an old science institute in New York City. Why did you move around so much as a child? Upward mobility and geographical mobility. My father, started in the mines. He got an education. We followed him from job to job. In 1969, you had your first book published. You wrote it along with your husband, and this is it: Long March, Short Spring: The Student Uprising at Home and Abroad. What were you trying to do, and what was it like to have this first book? Well, we were asked by Monthly Review Press if we would travel to Europe and hang out with the student movements there, and that's what we did. So we went to, I think, France, very class health system at that time. And at that time was really so much better than now, because most people could afford health insurance. It was just that the health insurance available in the low-income neighborhoods meant you were really going to be like teaching a research material for some medical school. Now, how did this come home to you in your own personal life? You were having children? Were your children? Yes, the first pregnancy. I went to a clinic. Mm-hmm. We couldn't afford private care, so I went to a New York City hospital clinic. I won't mention which one. And the care, I wouldn't say it was technically terrible, but it was remarkably sexist. I remember in my 9th month of pregnancy asking a question and perhaps using a technical word. Remember, I had a PhD in biology now. And the doctor saying, "Now, where did a nice little girl like you learn a word like that?" And it infuriated me. And so it nudged me more into feminism, which I had never thought about. I never thought about my gender. I mean, I'd had opportunities that were beyond anything my mother could have imagined, so I didn't feel affected. So I think I like to say that in July 1970, 2 feminists were born. One was my daughter, and one was me. We are going to have a 3-hour, in-depth conversation this afternoon with Barbara Ehrenreich, who has over, 13 books? Somewhere around that order? That's what you count. The most popular so far has been this book, Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America, sold over 2 million copies. We'll start taking your calls in about 15 minutes, but for those of you who would like to join us via email to ask questions to Ms. Ehrenreich, you can email us at this address, which is booktv@cspan.org. Again, phone calls not for another 15 minutes, but you might want to go ahead and get your emails in booktv@cspan.org. How many years? Let's see, you were 6 years away from Nickel and Dime now? Probably. It was 2001 it was published. Published in 2001. How do you look back on it now? 2 million copies. Did you ever dream it would sell that much? Oh, heavens, no. I actually didn't want to work on this because I was involved in another book, and I didn't want to interrupt the research. The other book has finally come out. It's called Dancing in the Streets. It's a very scholarly book for me, with lots of research and lots of footnotes and so on. I didn't want to interrupt that, but I got myself trapped into Nickel and Dimed by a conversation with the editor of Harper's Magazine, Louis Lapham, was the editor then, and I was pitching him a completely different idea. And then I got talking about a favorite theme of mine, which was welfare reform, and how were women coming off of welfare going to live on the wages available to them? Because I could just look at my local newspaper and see what those wages were. And I said, in frustration, complete frustration, I said, I mean, my father was certainly a patriotic man. He wanted to fight in World War II, but he was blind in one eye from a childhood accident, and he couldn't. But he just couldn't stand it when people, sort of beat their breasts if I'm more American than you are.
Your mother went to the 1964 Democratic National Convention?
Yes, she was very proud. She was an alternate delegate from Iowa. And she got there and she joined the sit-in of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was powerfully moved by their desire for representation instead of the white Dixiecrats who represented the South in the Democratic Party then. And she joined the sit-in. I don't know how many white people did, but I was very proud of her.
You were about 23, something like that, about that time?
Something, yeah.
What was that like to have your mother at the Democratic National Convention and have her in a sit-in? How did you feel at the time, I guess is my question.
In some ways I was a little mystified, that she would do that. But it was a lesson to me. I myself was beginning to see, yes, there were situations when I might do something like that. But she led the way.
We have a picture of you when you were very, very young with your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about your grandmother.
That's my grandmother, Bernice Oxley. She was a miner's wife, as, I guess we're most of the women in Butte, Montana. She was a very hardworking, stoical sort of woman. When her husband died, she had a little pension, but she went to work in her 80s. She got the credentials in her 80s to become like an LPN, to become a practical nurse. And she worked as a practical nurse throughout her 80s. She was amazing.
Did that have any impact on your later work in the health movement?
No. I mean, I think I was already involved in healthcare. An odd thing about that grandmother is she never complained about anything. Toward the end of her life, and she died when she was 102, she would say, well, I guess I can't complain. I always had enough to eat and a place to sleep. Well, okay.
Is that enough for you?
No, I don't think it's enough for most people. I'm just saying that's a kind of a mentality that we don't have so much anymore.
I guess I asked you because you write a lot about the overconsumption, America's overconsumption, you mentioned in some of your essays.
Oh yes, she was not part of that, no. She was very happy to she liked to read a lot, she watched the news all the time when she was a widow, which is when I knew her best.
Now, on the other side of the family, everybody has potentially apocryphal stories in their past, but in that 1990 book, you write about your great-grandmother and the fact that she was raised Catholic, which surprised me a little bit.
I'm not
great-grand.
Yeah, and her name was Mamie O'Laughlin. She was a Catholic, and very exciting in 1968. I mean, we got there in just after the big blow-up in May '68. Went to Italy, we went to Germany, England, and we also wrote about Columbia University in this country. So it was, I guess, my first experience ever as a reporter.
Had you been had you done your own anti-war movement type of thing for yourself as a student?
Yeah, my then husband, John Ehrenreich, and I were involved in the anti-war movement, and that's, I think, why they asked us to do this. Why they thought we could write a book, I don't know.
Why did you dedicate the book to the Vietnamese people?
Because, at that time we felt bad, as did so many anti-war activists, for what was being done to their country by that war. We call it the Vietnam War. I'm sure they call it the American War or something. And we felt bad. There were 1 million deaths of Vietnamese people in that war. 55,000 American deaths. So I guess that was a gesture to say, sorry.
Did that, the anti-war movement that you were involved in, how did that impact the rest of your writing life, not necessarily just on war, but on other issues too?
Well, it really pried me away from my science career. You know, I had been a pretty good student. I had bopped around from one science to another, from physics to chemistry to physics to biology. But I began to question, is this really what I want to do with my life? What impact am I really having in the world? Suppose I do something that leads to a cure for some disease, wonderful, but what kind of health system is out there to distribute that cure? So I got very concerned about health care, among other issues, and began to think, well, I want to be more directly involved in things that I think are affecting people's lives in a good way. Now, I think I also, to tell you the truth, was not really cut out for laboratory research.
Your biology was your PhD.
Yes, but I'm too impatient. I want the answer now, or in a week maybe. I want to spend weeks and weeks washing test tubes and worrying about a contamination of some sample or something. I'm sorry.
The issues that, on the health issues, came into your books in 1970. It's been over 35 years since this book was published, The American Health Empire. What were you looking for and what did you find?
Well, this book is actually compiles a lot of people's work that we did a little group called Health Policy Advisory Center. And we did investigative work about the healthcare system nationally and in New York City, where we were based. So we were putting all that together. And we were really appalled by how poor the treatment of the poor is. And I think if we were doing it today, we'd have to say it would be a lot worse. But, you know, that was our concern.